8 years ago, a man saved my life and then vanished as if he never existed. Today, he walked into my office as an ordinary contractor, and when I made him an offer that could change his life, he looked me straight in the eye and said no. No one has ever refused Victoria Sterling, but Daniel Hayes is no ordinary man, and between us lies a secret neither of us is ready to face, a secret that could destroy everything I've built or ultimately show me something truly more valuable than power. Follow this story to the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The call came at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, which was already the wrong time for anything good. Victoria Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office on the 47th floor, phone pressed to her ear, watching the city below blur into streaks of gold and shadow as the sun dropped behind the skyline. Her assistant's voice was calm, measured, the kind of calm that meant something had gone sideways. "Miss Sterling, the contractor is here." Victoria didn't turn from the window. "Which one?" "Daniel Hayes, the one you requested for the Midwest expansion project." She frowned. Hayes. The name sat in her mind like a stone she couldn't place. She'd been through a dozen contractors in the last 3 months, all of them perfectly competent, all of them forgettable. This one had come recommended by someone in procurement, a man whose work spoke louder than his resume, or so they'd said. She didn't remember asking for him specifically, but then again she didn't remember half of what crossed her desk anymore. 18-hour days had a way of blurring the details. "Send him in." She set the phone down and turned back to her desk, straightening the already straight files in front of her, a habit she couldn't shake even when no one was looking. The door opened a moment later, and her assistant stepped aside to let the contractor through. Victoria looked up, and for reasons she couldn't name, her breath caught. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested labor rather than a gym membership, with dark hair that needed a trim and a face that looked like it had taken a few hits and decided not to care. He wore jeans and a canvas jacket over a faded Henley, boots that had seen real work, and he carried a worn leather folder under one arm, like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. He didn't smile, didn't offer his hand, just stood there in the doorway and met her eyes with a kind of quiet, unreadable steadiness that made her feel like she was the one being evaluated. "Mr. Hayes," she said, recovering quickly, "please, sit." He didn't move right away. His gaze swept the room once, taking in the glass desk, the minimalist furniture, the abstract art on the walls that cost more than most people made in a year. Then he walked forward and sat, but he didn't lean back. He stayed upright, alert, like a man who'd learned not to get too comfortable. Victoria sat across from him and folded her hands on the desk. "I've reviewed your portfolio. Your work is impressive." "Thank you." His voice was low, rough around the edges, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. She waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Just looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes and waited. She cleared her throat. "Sterling Global is expanding into the Midwest. We're building 3 new distribution centers, and we need someone who can oversee the structural work from the ground up. The timeline is aggressive. 8 months, start to finish. It's a significant contract." "I've seen the specs," he said. "Then you know what we're offering." "I do." She leaned forward slightly, studying him. Most contractors would have been selling themselves by now, pitching their experience, their reliability, their willingness to do whatever it took. Hayes just sat there like he was waiting for her to get to the point. "This project is critical," she said. "If it succeeds, it positions Sterling Global as a leader in logistics infrastructure across the region. If it fails, it costs us credibility and a significant amount of capital. I don't hire people who fail." "Good policy." The faintest flicker of irritation sparked in her chest. "Mr. Hayes, I'm offering you an opportunity most people in your field would consider career-defining. I need to know if you're the right person for it." He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering her words. Then he said, "What makes you think I want it?" Victoria blinked. "Excuse me?" "I asked what makes you think I want the job." She stared at him. In 15 years of running Sterling Global, no one had ever asked her that question. People wanted what she offered. They wanted the money, the prestige, the chance to attach their name to something bigger than themselves. That was how the world worked. "You're here," she said carefully. "That suggests interest." "I'm here because your people called me," Hayes said. "Doesn't mean I'm interested." The irritation sharpened into something closer to disbelief. "Then why did you agree to this meeting?" Curiosity. Curiosity. Wanted to see what kind of person builds an empire and then hires strangers to hold it up. Her jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Not in her own office, not by someone she was offering $500,000. But there was something in the way he said it, something that wasn't quite mockery, not quite challenge, more like a test. "And what did you decide?" she asked, her voice cooler now. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strangest sense that he was seeing something she didn't want him to see, something she kept locked down tight. "That you're good at what you do," he said finally, "but you don't know the difference between opportunity and ownership." Victoria felt her spine stiffen. "I'm not sure I follow." "You think offering someone money means they owe you something," Hayes said, "like it's a trade, your dollars for their loyalty. But loyalty doesn't work that way. You can't buy it. You earn it." She didn't realize she'd stood until she was halfway around the desk, her hands braced against the edge. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know what you think this meeting is, but let me be very clear. I am offering you a contract that would set you up for the next 5 years. I am offering you access to resources, connections, and projects that most contractors never even hear about. If you're not interested, that's your choice. But don't insult me by pretending I'm asking for something unreasonable." He stood too, and even though she was wearing heels, he still had 4 inches on her. But he didn't crowd her space, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her with that same steady, infuriating calm. "I'm not pretending anything," he said. "You're asking for 8 months of my life on your timeline, your terms, your priorities. That's not unreasonable, but it's also not something I'm willing to give right now." "Why not?" "Because I have other priorities." "Such as?" "My daughter." The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria felt the ripples of it, the sudden shift in the room's temperature. She hadn't expected that, hadn't expected him to have a child, hadn't expected him to say it like it was the only answer that mattered. "I didn't see a family listed in your file," she said, her voice quieter now. "That's because I don't list her," Hayes said. "She's not part of my resume. She's my life." Victoria didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent so long building Sterling Global, so long making sure every piece of her world fit into a strategy, a plan, a goal. The idea of something existing outside of that, something that couldn't be negotiated or scheduled or controlled, felt almost foreign. "How old is she?" she asked. 7. "And her mother?" His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something dark and distant. "Not in the picture." Victoria nodded slowly. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know why a man with a daughter would turn down this kind of money, this kind of opportunity. But something in the way he stood there, guarded and unshakable, told her he wouldn't answer. Not to her, not now. "I respect your priorities," she said finally. "But I hope you understand this offer won't be open indefinitely." "I understand." "Then I suppose we're done here." Hayes picked up his folder and turned toward the door. But halfway there, he stopped and looked back at her. "For what it's worth," he said, "you didn't need to sell me on the job. Your reputation did that already. But reputation isn't the same as trust, and I don't work for people I don't trust." Then he walked out, and the door clicked shut behind him, and Victoria was left standing in the middle of her immaculate office, staring at the space where he'd been. She sat down slowly, her hands still trembling with something she couldn't name. Anger, maybe, or confusion, or something else entirely. She picked up her phone and called her assistant. "Get me everything we have on Daniel Hayes," she said. "Employment history, references, background, everything." "Of course, Ms. Sterling. Is there a problem?" Victoria looked at the closed door, her mind still turning over his words, the way he'd looked at her like he could see straight through the armor she'd spent years building. "No," she said quietly. "No problem, just curious." She hung up and leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the windows, to the city stretched out below her like a grid of light and shadow. Somewhere out there, Daniel Hayes was walking back to whatever life he'd built, to the daughter he'd chosen over $500,000. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria Sterling felt unsettled. Daniel Hayes stepped out of the Sterling Global building and into the chaos of rush hour, the noise of the city hitting him like a wall. Horns blaring, engines growling, people shouting into phones as they pushed past each other on the crowded sidewalk. He kept his head down and his hands in his pockets, moving through it all like a man who'd learned how to be invisible. He didn't look back at the building, didn't need to. He could still feel her eyes on him, sharp and searching, like she was trying to figure out a puzzle she didn't know she was solving. Victoria Sterling. The woman whose face had been on the cover of business magazines, whose name showed up in articles about innovation and ruthlessness in equal measure. She was exactly what he'd expected. Brilliant, controlled, used to getting what she wanted. But there'd been something else too. Something in the way she'd looked at him when he'd mentioned Sophie, like the idea of a life outside of work was almost incomprehensible to her. He'd met people like that before. People who built walls so high they forgot what it felt like to stand on the other side. He pushed the thought away and kept walking. The subway was packed, but he found a spot near the back of the car and leaned against the pole, watching the stations blur past. 40 minutes later, he was climbing the stairs to street level in a neighborhood that looked nothing like the one he'd just left. No glass towers here, no polished sidewalks, just row houses with peeling paint, corner stores with bars on the windows, and a park where kids played basketball under a chain-link fence that had seen better days. Home. He walked 3 blocks to a narrow brick building with a faded green awning and took the stairs to the second floor. The door was unlocked, which meant Sophie was already inside. He pushed it open and stepped into the small, cluttered living room, the smell of something burning hitting him immediately. "Sophie? In here!" He followed the smoke to the kitchen, where his daughter stood on a stool in front of the stove, poking at something in a pan with a wooden spoon. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and she wore an oversized t-shirt that hung down to her knees. She looked up at him with wide, guilty eyes. "I was making dinner," she said. Daniel crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and turned off the burner, peering into the pan at what might have once been scrambled eggs but now looked closer to charcoal. "You were making something," he said. "I wanted to help." He looked down at her, at the earnest, hopeful expression on her face, and felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly. "I appreciate that, kiddo, but maybe next time, wait for me to get home first, yeah? You were gone a long time." "I know. I'm sorry." He lifted her off the stool and set her down on the floor, then opened the window to let the smoke out. Sophie hovered near his elbow, watching him with the kind of focus she usually reserved for cartoons. "Where'd you go?" she asked. "Meeting." "For work?" "Sort of." "Did you get the job?" He glanced at her, surprised. "What makes you think it was about a job?" She shrugged. "You were wearing your good jacket." Daniel looked down at the canvas jacket he'd thrown on that morning, the one with the torn lining and the stain on the sleeve. "This is my good jacket?" "It's the one you wear when you want people to think you care." He laughed, short and unexpected, and ruffled her hair. "You're too smart for your own good, you know that?" "That's what Mrs. Patterson says." Mrs. Patterson was the neighbor who watched Sophie after school when Daniel couldn't be home. She was 72, hard of hearing, and had a habit of feeding Sophie cookies before dinner, but she was reliable, and she didn't ask questions Daniel didn't want to answer. "Well, Mrs. Patterson's right," Daniel said. He tossed the ruined eggs into the trash and opened the fridge, scanning the mostly empty shelves. "How do you feel about mac and cheese? The good kind or the box kind? What do you think?" Sophie grinned. "Box kind." "Damn right." He set a pot of water on the stove and pulled out the box of pasta, and Sophie climbed onto the counter to watch him work, swinging her legs and humming something off-key. For a while, neither of them said anything, just the sound of water starting to boil and the faint noise of the city outside the window. "Dad," Sophie said after a while. "Yeah?" "Are we poor?" Daniel's hand stilled on the box. He looked at her, at the question in her eyes that was too big for a 7-year-old to be asking. "Why would you ask that?" "Emma at school said her mom said we probably don't have a lot of money because we live in a small apartment and you don't have a fancy job." Daniel felt a flicker of anger, not at Sophie, but at whoever the hell Emma's mom was, and the fact that kids repeated things they didn't understand. He set the box down and turned to face his daughter fully. "We're not poor," he said. "We have everything we need. But we don't have everything we want." "Nobody does, Soph. Not really." She frowned, thinking about that. "Emma's mom drives a really nice car. Good for her." "Don't you want a nice car?" I want you to be safe and happy, Daniel said. That's what I want. Everything else is just noise. Sophie considered this, her small face serious. Then she nodded, like she'd decided to believe him. Okay, okay. He poured the pasta into the boiling water and stirred it, and Sophie went back to humming, and the moment passed. But the question stayed with him, sitting heavy in the back of his mind. He thought about Victoria Sterling's office, about the kind of money she'd offered, the kind of life it could buy. A bigger apartment, a car that didn't break down every other month, maybe even a savings account that didn't make him wince every time he checked it. But he also thought about the look in her eyes when she'd talked about the project, the way she'd leaned forward like she was already 3 steps ahead, already planning, already calculating. She didn't see him as a person. She saw him as a piece on a board, something to be moved and used and discarded when it stopped being useful. He'd lived that life before. He wasn't going back. After dinner, he helped Sophie with her homework, which mostly involved him pretending to understand second-grade math while she explained it to him like he was the one in school. Then he read her a chapter from the book they were working through, a story about a girl who talked to animals and went on adventures that always seemed to end right when things got interesting. That's not fair, Sophie said when he closed the book. We have to wait a whole day to find out what happens next? That's how books work, kiddo. Books are mean. He smiled and tucked the blanket around her. Get some sleep. I'll see you in the morning. Promise? Promise. She closed her eyes, and he sat there for a moment longer, watching her breathe, watching the way her face relaxed into something peaceful and unguarded. She looked like her mother in moments like this, and it hurt in a way he'd learned to carry. He stood and turned off the light, pulling the door halfway closed behind him. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the small kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, expecting a text from Mrs. Patterson or maybe a spam call. Instead, it was an email from Sterling Global. He opened it, frowning. Mr. Hayes, thank you for meeting with me today. While I respect your decision, I wanted to extend an invitation to reconsider. Sterling Global values talent, and I believe you have something we need. If circumstances change, please don't hesitate to reach out. Best, Victoria Sterling. Daniel read it twice, then set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. She wasn't giving up. That should have annoyed him, should have made him delete the email and forget about it. But instead, he found himself thinking about the way she'd stood in front of her desk, her hands braced against the edge like she was holding herself together by force of will. She didn't know him, didn't know what he'd done, where he'd been, or why he'd walked away from that world. And that was exactly how it needed to stay. He deleted the email and went to bed. Victoria didn't sleep well that night. She told herself it was because of the investor meeting in the morning, the one that could make or break the Midwest expansion. But when she woke at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling of her penthouse bedroom, she knew that wasn't it. It was him, Daniel Hayes. She'd spent the evening reading through the file her assistant had sent over, looking for something that would explain why a contractor with his skill set would turn down this kind of opportunity. But the file was thin, too thin. A few jobs here and there over the last 8 years, all of them solid, all of them unremarkable. No social media presence, no interviews, no references beyond the people he'd worked for directly. It was like he'd appeared out of nowhere, or like he was hiding. She got out of bed and walked to the windows, looking out at the city below. The light stretched endlessly in every direction, a grid of ambition and exhaustion. And somewhere out there, Daniel Hayes was probably asleep, probably not thinking about her at all. The thought bothered her more than it should have. She pulled out her phone and opened a search engine, typing his name into the bar. A few results came up, generic LinkedIn profiles, a mention in a local news article about a community renovation project, nothing substantial. She scrolled further, clicking through pages of results that led nowhere. Then she saw it. A name buried in a police report from 8 years ago. Unidentified male, mid-30s, intervened in an assault near the warehouse district. Victim transported to Memorial Hospital. Suspect fled. Good Samaritan vanished before officers arrived. Victoria's breath caught. She clicked on the report, scanning the details. The victim's name had been redacted, but the date was there. March 14th, 8 years ago. The night she'd almost died. Her hand started to shake. She remembered pieces of it, flashes really. The alley. The man with the knife. The way her ribs had screamed when he'd shoved her against the wall. The sound of her own voice, begging, pleading, and then nothing. She'd woken up in the hospital with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a memory full of holes. The police had told her someone had intervened, someone who'd scared off her attacker, and stayed with her until the ambulance arrived. But by the time officers got there, he was gone. No name, no description, just a ghost. She'd spent months trying to find him, trying to piece together who he was, what he'd looked like, why he'd saved her, and then disappeared. But the trail had gone cold, and eventually she'd had to let it go. But now she was looking at Daniel Hayes' face, and something in her chest was screaming that it was him. She didn't have proof, didn't have anything except a gut feeling, and a police report that mentioned an unidentified man. But the timing was right. The location was right. And the way he'd looked at her in her office like he knew something she didn't. That was right too. Victoria sat down on the edge of her bed, her phone still clutched in her hand, her mind racing. If it was him, if Daniel Hayes was the man who'd saved her life, why hadn't he said anything? Why had he walked away? And why, after 8 years, had he come back? She didn't have answers, but she was damn sure going to find them. The next morning, Daniel was halfway through replacing the drywall in a client's kitchen when his phone rang. He ignored it the first time, focusing on getting the seam right, but when it rang again 30 seconds later, he sighed and pulled off his gloves. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him hit the green button and press the phone to his ear. Yeah? Mr. Hayes, this is Carolyn Trent. I'm the head of procurement at Sterling Global. Daniel frowned. I already talked to Ms. Sterling. I know. She asked me to reach out. Why? There was a pause on the other end, and he could hear the sound of papers shuffling. She'd like to meet with you again. Today, if possible. I'm working. She's willing to work around your schedule. I'm not interested. Mr. Hayes? I was clear yesterday, Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. I'm not taking the job. I appreciate the offer, but the answer's no. She's not asking about the job. That stopped him. Then what's she asking about? Another pause, longer this time. I don't know, she didn't say, but she was insistent. Daniel felt something cold settle in his gut. He didn't like this. Didn't like the way it felt like a door he'd closed was being pried back open. Tell her I'll think about it, he said. She'd prefer a definite answer. That's the best I've got. He hung up before Carolyn could argue and stared at the phone in his hand, his mind already running through possibilities, none of them good. Victoria Sterling wanted to see him again, and she wasn't asking about work, which meant she knew something, or thought she did. Daniel shoved the phone back in his pocket and picked up his tools, but his hands weren't steady anymore. He'd been careful. He'd covered his tracks, kept his head down, built a life that didn't draw attention. But careful didn't mean invisible. And if Victoria Sterling was digging, if she'd figured out who he really was, then everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built to keep Sophie safe, was about to come crashing down. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. 3 days passed before Victoria made her next move, and Daniel spent every one of them looking over his shoulder. He told himself he was being paranoid, told himself that a CEO of a billion-dollar company had better things to do than chase down a contractor who'd turned her down. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat in his chest like a weight, heavy and insistent. The kind of weight that came from years of knowing when something was about to go wrong. On Thursday afternoon, he was finishing up a job in Brooklyn when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, expecting another call from Carolyn Trent or maybe a text from Mrs. Patterson about Sophie. Instead, it was a message from a number he didn't recognize. We need to talk. Meet me at Riverside Park, North Entrance, 6 p.m. Come alone. No name, no signature. Just the message and a location. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tightening. He could ignore it, could delete the message, and pretend he'd never seen it. But whoever sent it knew his number, knew where to find him, and that meant ignoring it wouldn't make the problem go away. He typed back, "Who is this?" The response came 30 seconds later. You know who. He did. He thought about not going. Thought about picking up Sophie from school, taking her to the park like they did every Thursday, pretending this wasn't happening. But if Victoria Sterling wanted answers badly enough to track down his personal number, She wasn't going to stop. And if she kept digging, kept asking questions, eventually she'd find something he couldn't afford for her to find. Better to face it now, on his terms. He texted back, "I'll be there." At 5:45, he dropped Sophie off at Mrs. Patterson's apartment with a promise to be back by 7:30. Sophie gave him a suspicious look, the kind that said she knew something was up but wasn't old enough yet to call him on it, and he kissed the top of her head and left before she could ask questions he didn't want to answer. Riverside Park was quiet when he arrived, the kind of quiet that came right before the evening rush when people started flooding in for their post-work runs and dog walks. He found the north entrance and stopped just inside the gate, scanning the area. She was sitting on a bench near the water, her back to him, wearing a tailored coat and heels that had no business being in a park. Her hair was down, longer than he'd realized, and she sat perfectly still, staring out at the river like she was waiting for something to appear on the horizon. Daniel walked over slowly, his hands in his pockets, his footsteps deliberate enough that she'd hear him coming. She didn't turn around, didn't move, just kept staring at the water. "Ms. Sterling," he said when he was close enough. "Sit." It wasn't a request. He sat anyway, leaving a foot of space between them on the bench, and waited. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy, and he could feel her tension like a live wire. Finally she spoke. "8 years ago," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I was attacked. Late at night, near the warehouse district. A man with a knife. I don't remember most of it, but I remember someone pulling him off me. I remember lying on the ground, bleeding, and someone telling me to stay awake. That help was coming." Daniel's chest tightened, but he kept his face neutral. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "The police said the man who helped me disappeared before they arrived," Victoria continued, still not looking at him. "No name, no description, just gone. I spent months trying to find him, trying to figure out who he was, why he saved me, why he left. But I never could." She turned to him then, and the look in her eyes was sharp enough to cut. "It was you, wasn't it?" Daniel held her gaze, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline starting to creep into his veins. He could lie, could tell her she was wrong, that she was seeing connections that weren't there. But lying to Victoria Sterling felt like a waste of both their time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It was me." The breath she let out was shaky, like she'd been holding it for 8 years. "Why didn't you stay? Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" "Because I couldn't." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Her jaw tightened, and he could see the frustration building in her, the need to understand something that didn't make sense in the world she'd built for herself. "Do you have any idea what that night did to me? What it was like to wake up in a hospital with no memory, no answers, just fragments? I didn't even know if the person who saved me was real, or if I'd imagined him." "You didn't imagine him. Then why the hell did you leave?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked out at the river. The water was dark, moving slow and steady, and for a moment he let himself think about how to explain something he'd never had to explain before. "I was working a job that night," he said finally. "Not the kind you put on a resume. The kind where you don't leave a trail, don't ask questions, and sure as hell don't stick around to talk to cops." "What kind of job?" "The kind that doesn't exist anymore." She stared at him, and he could feel her trying to piece it together, trying to fit him into a box that made sense. "You were military." "Something like that." "That's not an answer either." "It's close enough." Victoria shook her head, her hands tightening into fists on her lap. "You saved my life. You took a bullet doing it, and then you just walked away. Like it didn't matter. It mattered. Then why didn't you stay?" "Because staying would have put other people at risk," Daniel said, his voice harder now. "People I was responsible for, people who were counting on me to keep my mouth shut and disappear. So that's what I did." "And you never looked back." "I looked back plenty," he said quietly. "I just didn't come forward." The silence that followed was thick, loaded with things neither of them wanted to say. Victoria looked away, her shoulders tight, and Daniel wondered if she was angry or relieved or something in between. "How did you find me?" he asked. "I didn't. You walked into my office." "That's not what I mean." She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him without a word. He unfolded it and saw a printed copy of the police report, the one he'd hoped had been buried deep enough that no one would ever connect the dots. "I've been looking for you for 8 years, Victoria said. I had investigators, private detectives, people who specialize in finding ghosts. None of them found anything. And then you showed up in my office, and something about you felt familiar. I couldn't place it, but I couldn't let it go either." Daniel folded the paper and handed it back to her. "So now you know." "Now I know," she echoed, "but I still don't understand why you turned down the job. If you needed money—" "I don't need your money. Everyone needs money." "Not like that," Daniel said. "Not in exchange for my life." Victoria frowned. "It's a construction project, not a prison sentence. It's 8 months of being on call, being available, being somewhere other than where I need to be. That's not a trade I'm willing to make. Because of your daughter. Because of my daughter." She looked at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read the expression on her face. "What happened to her mother?" Daniel's hands tightened in his lap. "She left 3 years ago. Decided being a mom wasn't what she signed up for." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. We're better off." Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Yeah, I do. Most people would have taken the money, would have figured out a way to make it work. I'm not most people." "No," she said softly. "You're not." The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the park, and Daniel checked his watch. 6:20. He had just over an hour before he needed to pick up Sophie. "Is that all you wanted?" he asked. "To confirm I was the guy?" Victoria hesitated, and he saw something shift in her expression, something uncertain. "I wanted to know why you didn't ask for anything. Why you didn't want credit, recognition, payment. People don't do that. They don't save someone's life and then vanish without expecting something in return." "Maybe I didn't need anything in return." "Everyone needs something." Daniel looked at her, at the woman who'd built an empire on the belief that everything could be bought, traded, negotiated. And he realized she didn't understand because she'd never had to. She'd never been in a position where the only thing that mattered was getting out alive. "I needed to make sure you were okay," he said. "That's all. And then you left." "And then I left." Victoria looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. And for the first time since he'd met her, she looked lost, like the ground beneath her had shifted and she didn't know how to find her footing. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You don't have to." "I do. You saved my life. That's not something I can just ignore." "Then don't ignore it," Daniel said. "Just don't make it into something it's not." She turned to him, her eyes sharp again. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I didn't save you because I wanted something from you. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. That's it. There's no debt, no obligation. You don't owe me anything." "But I want to—" "I know," Daniel said, standing. "But wanting to do something doesn't mean you should." He started to walk away, but her voice stopped him. "Wait." He turned back, and she was standing now too, her coat pulled tight around her like armor. "If you ever change your mind," she said, "about the job or anything else, the offer stands." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who'd spent 8 years searching for a ghost, and finally found him sitting on a bench in a park. He wanted to tell her to let it go, to move on, to stop looking for answers in places that would only complicate her life. But he didn't think she'd listen. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Sterling," he said. Then he turned and walked away, and this time she didn't call him back. Victoria stood in the park long after Daniel disappeared into the crowd, the folded police report still clutched in her hand. She felt like she'd been holding her breath for 8 years, and had just now remembered how to exhale. He was real. The man who'd saved her, the man she'd spent countless hours and thousands of dollars trying to find, was real. And he'd been sitting in her office 3 days ago, turning down $500,000 like it was pocket change. She didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it out to see a message from her assistant. "Investor meeting moved to tomorrow, 9 a.m. Confirming your attendance." Victoria stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly. The meeting, the expansion, the company. All the things that had consumed her life for the last 15 years. All the things she'd built and fought for and protected. And yet, standing here in the fading light, none of it felt as important as the conversation she'd just had. She typed back, "Confirmed." Then she slipped the phone into her pocket and walked back to her car, her mind still turning over Daniel's words. "You don't owe me anything." But she did. She owed him her life. And Victoria Sterling didn't leave debts unpaid. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of Sophie singing in the kitchen, off-key and enthusiastic, something about a princess and a dragon that she'd probably made up herself. He lay in bed for a moment, listening, letting the sound ground him. Last night had been a mistake. He shouldn't have gone to the park. Shouldn't have confirmed what Victoria already suspected. Because now she knew, and knowing meant she'd keep coming back, keep asking questions, keep trying to fit him into a narrative that made sense to her. And the more she dug, the closer she'd get to things he couldn't let her find. He got up and walked into the kitchen, where Sophie was standing on a chair in front of the stove, pouring cereal into a bowl with intense concentration. "Morning, kiddo," he said. "Morning. I made breakfast." "I can see that." "Do you want some?" "Sure." She poured him a bowl, sloshing milk over the side, and handed it to him with a grin. He took it and sat down at the table, watching her climb into the chair across from him. "Did you have a good time at Mrs. Patterson's?" he asked. "She let me watch 2 episodes instead of 1. Rebel." Sophie giggled and took a bite of cereal, milk dripping down her chin. "Dad?" "Yeah? Are you okay?" He looked up, surprised. "Why do you ask?" "You look tired." "I'm always tired." "More than usual." Daniel set his spoon down and reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I'm fine, Soph. Just got a lot on my mind." "Is it about work?" "Sort of." "Is someone being mean to you?" He smiled despite himself. "No, nothing like that." "Then what?" "Just grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." Sophie frowned, clearly unsatisfied with that answer, but she didn't push. She just went back to her cereal, swinging her legs under the table. Daniel's phone buzzed, and he pulled it out, expecting a text from a client or maybe a reminder about a job he'd forgotten. Instead, it was another message from an unknown number. "I have a proposition. Not about the job. Something else. Call me when you have a chance. V.S." He stared at the message, his jaw tightening. She wasn't going to let this go. He set the phone down and finished his cereal, ignoring the way his pulse had started to pick up. Whatever Victoria Sterling wanted, it could wait. Right now, he had a daughter to get ready for school and a life to keep running. But the message sat in the back of his mind all morning, nagging at him like a splinter he couldn't dig out. At noon, after he'd dropped Sophie off and finished the first half of a drywall job, he finally called the number. She picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Hayes, what do you want?" "Straight to the point. I appreciate that." "I don't have time for games, Ms. Sterling." "Neither do I," she said, "which is why I'm calling. I have a problem, and I think you might be able to help me solve it." Daniel leaned against the side of his truck, his free hand rubbing the back of his neck. "I already told you, I'm not interested in the job. This isn't about the job, it's about something else. Something personal." That got his attention. "What kind of personal?" There was a pause, and he could hear the sound of her moving, a door closing, the faint hum of an office in the background. "Someone's been digging into my company," she said quietly, "looking for dirt, trying to find leverage. I don't know who yet, but I know it's happening, and I need someone I can trust to help me figure out who and why." "You have a whole company full of people you can trust." "Do I?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest. He'd heard that tone before. The tone of someone who'd been burned and didn't know who to turn to. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you're the only person in the last 8 years who hasn't wanted anything from me," Victoria said. "And right now, that's the only qualification that matters." Daniel closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the truck. He should say no. Should tell her to hire a security firm, a private investigator, someone whose job it was to deal with corporate espionage. But something in her voice stopped him. She wasn't asking as a CEO. She was asking as the woman who'd been lying in an alley 8 years ago, bleeding and scared and alone. "I'm not a detective," he said. "I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to watch my back, just for a little while, until I figure out who I'm dealing with. And if I say no, then I'll figure it out on my own. But I'd rather not." Daniel opened his eyes and stared at the sky, at the clouds moving slow and steady overhead. He thought about Sophie, about the life he'd built, about all the reasons this was a bad idea. Then he thought about the way Victoria had looked at him in the park, like she was holding on by a thread and didn't want to admit it. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking. I'm not making any promises." "I know." He hung up and shoved the phone back in his pocket, his mind already racing. This was a mistake. He knew it was a mistake, but he also knew he was probably going to do it anyway, because walking away from someone who needed help had never been something he was good at, even when it would have been smarter. That night, after Sophie was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open in front of him. He hadn't touched it in weeks, maybe months, but the muscle memory came back fast. A few keystrokes, a few passwords he'd sworn he'd never use again, and he was in. The internet was a different place when you knew where to look. He started with Sterling Global, pulling up financial records, board meeting notes, internal memos that were supposed to be private but weren't if you knew how to bypass a firewall. Most of it was boring: quarterly earnings, expansion plans, the usual corporate noise. But buried in the noise were a few things that stood out. A pattern of small data breaches over the last 6 months. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would raise alarms, but consistent enough to suggest someone was looking for something specific. A series of encrypted emails between Victoria and her CFO, flagged by an internal security audit as potentially compromised, and a name that kept showing up in the margins, always just out of focus, always connected to people who had access but no clear reason to be involved. Marcus Rain. Daniel pulled up a separate search and started digging. Marcus Rain was Victoria's second in command, her right hand, the man who'd been with Sterling Global since the beginning. On paper, he was loyal, competent, indispensable. But on paper didn't mean a damn thing. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. If Marcus was dirty, if he was the one feeding information to someone outside the company, then Victoria's instincts were right. She had a problem, a big one. He closed the laptop and stared at the dark screen, his reflection faint and distorted in the glass. He'd told himself he was done with this. Done with the digging, the paranoia, the constant sense that the ground beneath him was about to crack open. He'd built a quiet life, a safe life, and dragging himself back into this world was the last thing he needed. But Victoria Sterling had asked for help, and Daniel Hayes had never been good at saying no to people who needed him, even when he should have been. The next morning, he called her back. "I'm in," he said when she picked up. "But we do this my way, no questions, no interference, and the second I think it's putting my daughter at risk, I'm out. Understood?" "Understood," Victoria said, and he could hear the relief in her voice, faint but unmistakable. "Good. Meet me tonight. Same place as before. 7 o'clock. I'll be there." Daniel hung up and looked at the phone in his hand, at the choice he'd just made, the line he'd just crossed. He hoped like hell he wouldn't regret it. 3 days passed before Victoria made her next move, and Daniel spent every one of them looking over his shoulder. He told himself he was being paranoid, told himself that a CEO of a billion-dollar company had better things to do than chase down a contractor who'd turned her down. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat in his chest like a weight, heavy and insistent, the kind of weight that came from years of knowing when something was about to go wrong. On Thursday afternoon, he was finishing up a job in Brooklyn when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, expecting another call from Carolyn Trent, or maybe a text from Mrs. Patterson about Sophie. Instead, it was a message from a number he didn't recognize. "We need to talk. Meet me at Riverside Park, North Entrance, 6 p.m. Come alone." No name, no signature, just the message and a location. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tightening. He could ignore it, could delete the message and pretend he'd never seen it, but whoever sent it knew his number, knew where to find him, and that meant ignoring it wouldn't make the problem go away. He typed back, "Who is this?" The response came 30 seconds later. "You know who." He did. He thought about not going. Thought about picking up Sophie from school, taking her to the park like they did every Thursday, pretending this wasn't happening. But if Victoria Sterling wanted answers badly enough to track down his personal number, she wasn't going to stop. And if she kept digging, kept asking questions, eventually she'd find something he couldn't afford for her to find. Better to face it now, on his terms. He texted back, "I'll be there, At 5:45, he dropped Sophie off at Mrs. Patterson's apartment with a promise to be back by 7:30. Sophie gave him a suspicious look, the kind that said she knew something was up but wasn't old enough yet to call him on it, and he kissed the top of her head and left before she could ask questions he didn't want to answer. Riverside Park was quiet when he arrived, the kind of quiet that came right before the evening rush when people started flooding in for their post-work runs and dog walks. He found the north entrance and stopped just inside the gate, scanning the area. She was sitting on a bench near the water, her back to him, wearing a tailored coat and heels that had no business being in a park. Her hair was down, longer than he'd realized, and she sat perfectly still, staring out at the river like she was waiting for something to appear on the horizon. Daniel walked over slowly, his hands in his pockets, his footsteps deliberate enough that she'd hear him coming. She didn't turn around, didn't move, just kept staring at the water. "Ms. Sterling," he said when he was close enough. "Sit." It wasn't a request. He sat anyway, leaving a foot of space between them on the bench, and waited. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy, and he could feel her tension like a live wire. Finally, she spoke. "8 years ago," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I was attacked. Late at night, near the warehouse district. A man with a knife. I don't remember most of it, but I remember someone pulling him off me. I remember lying on the ground, bleeding, and someone telling me to stay awake. That help was coming." Daniel's chest tightened, but he kept his face neutral. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "The police said the man who helped me disappeared before they arrived," Victoria continued, still not looking at him. "No name, no description, just gone. I spent months trying to find him, trying to figure out who he was, why he saved me, why he left. But I never could." She turned to him then, and the look in her eyes was sharp enough to cut. "It was you, wasn't it?" Daniel held her gaze, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline starting to creep into his veins. He could lie. Could tell her she was wrong, that she was seeing connections that weren't there, but lying to Victoria Sterling felt like a waste of both their time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It was me." The breath she let out was shaky, like she'd been holding it for 8 years. "Why didn't you stay? Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" "Because I couldn't." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Her jaw tightened, and he could see the frustration building in her, the need to understand something that didn't make sense in the world she'd built for herself. "Do you have any idea what that night did to me? What it was like to wake up in a hospital with no memory, no answers, just fragments? I didn't even know if the person who saved me was real or if I'd imagined him." "You didn't imagine him. Then why the hell did you leave?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked out at the river. The water was dark, moving slow and steady, and for a moment he let himself think about how to explain something he'd never had to explain before. "I was working a job that night," he said finally. "Not the kind you put on a resume. The kind where you don't leave a trail, don't ask questions, and sure as hell don't stick around to talk to cops." "What kind of job?" "The kind that doesn't exist anymore." She stared at him, and he could feel her trying to piece it together, trying to fit him into a box that made sense. "You were military. Something like that." "That's not an answer either." "It's close enough." Victoria shook her head, her hands tightening into fists on her lap. "You saved my life. You took a bullet doing it, and then you just walked away. Like it didn't matter." "It mattered." "Then why didn't you stay?" "Because staying would have put other people at risk," Daniel said, his voice harder now. "People I was responsible for, people who were counting on me to keep my mouth shut and disappear. So that's what I did." "And you never looked back." "I looked back plenty," he said quietly. "I just didn't come forward." The silence that followed was thick, loaded with things neither of them wanted to say. Victoria looked away, her shoulders tight, and Daniel wondered if she was angry or relieved or something in between. "How did you find me?" he asked. "I didn't. You walked into my office." "That's not what I mean." She hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him without a word. He unfolded it and saw a printed copy of the police report, the one he'd hoped had been buried deep enough that no one would ever connect the dots. "I've been looking for you for 8 years, Victoria said. "I had investigators, private detectives, people who specialize in finding ghosts. None of them found anything. And then you showed up in my office, and something about you felt Familiar. I couldn't place it, but I couldn't let it go either. Daniel folded the paper and handed it back to her. So now you know. Now I know, she echoed. But I still don't understand why you turned down the job. If you needed money, I don't need your money. Everyone needs money. Not like that, Daniel said. Not in exchange for my life. Victoria frowned. It's a construction project, not a prison sentence. It's 8 months of being on call, being available, being somewhere other than where I need to be. That's not a trade I'm willing to make. Because of your daughter. Because of my daughter. She looked at him for a long moment, and he couldn't read the expression on her face. What happened to her mother? Daniel's hands tightened in his lap. She left 3 years ago. Decided being a mom wasn't what she signed up for. I'm sorry. Don't be. We're better off. Victoria tilted her head slightly, studying him. You really mean that, don't you? Yeah, I do. Most people would have taken the money, would have figured out a way to make it work. I'm not most people. No, she said softly. You're not. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the park, and Daniel checked his watch. 6:20. He had just over an hour before he needed to pick up Sophie. Is that all you wanted? He asked. To confirm I was the guy? Victoria hesitated, and he saw something shift in her expression. Something uncertain. I wanted to know why you didn't ask for anything. Why you didn't want credit, recognition, payment. People don't do that. They don't save someone's life and then vanish without expecting something in return. Maybe I didn't need anything in return. Everyone needs something. Daniel looked at her, at the woman who'd built an empire on the belief that everything could be bought, traded, negotiated, and he realized she didn't understand because she'd never had to. She'd never been in a position where the only thing that mattered was getting out alive. I needed to make sure you were okay, he said. That's all. And then you left. And then I left. Victoria looked away, her hands twisting in her lap, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked lost. Like the ground beneath her had shifted and she didn't know how to find her footing. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. You don't have to. I do. You saved my life. That's not something I can just ignore. Then don't ignore it, Daniel said. Just don't make it into something it's not. She turned to him, her eyes sharp again. What's that supposed to mean? It means I didn't save you because I wanted something from you. I saved you because it was the right thing to do. That's it. There's no debt. No obligation. You don't owe me anything. But I want to... I know, Daniel said, standing. But wanting to do something doesn't mean you should. He started to walk away, but her voice stopped him. Wait. He turned back, and she was standing now, too, her coat pulled tight around her like armor. If you ever change your mind, she said, about the job or anything else, the offer stands. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who'd spent 8 years searching for a ghost, and finally found him sitting on a bench in a park. He wanted to tell her to let it go, to move on, to stop looking for answers in places that would only complicate her life. But he didn't think she'd listen. Take care of yourself, Miss Sterling, he said. Then he turned and walked away, and this time she didn't call him back. Victoria stood in the park long after Daniel disappeared into the crowd, the folded police report still clutched in her hand. She felt like she'd been holding her breath for 8 years and had just now remembered how to exhale. He was real. The man who'd saved her, the man she'd spent countless hours and thousands of dollars trying to find, was real. And he'd been sitting in her office 3 days ago, turning down $500,000 like it was pocket change. She didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it out to see a message from her assistant. Investor meeting moved to tomorrow, 9 a.m., confirming your attendance. Victoria stared at the screen, the words blurring slightly. The meeting, the expansion, the company, all the things that had consumed her life for the last 15 years, all the things she'd built and fought for and protected. And yet, standing here in the fading light, none of it felt as important as the conversation she'd just had. She typed back, confirmed. Then she slipped the phone into her pocket and walked back to her car, her mind still turning over Daniel's words. You don't owe me anything. But she did. She owed him her life, and Victoria Sterling didn't leave debts unpaid. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of Sophie singing in the kitchen, off-key and enthusiastic, something about a princess and a dragon that she'd probably made up herself. He lay in bed for a moment, listening, letting the sound ground him. Last night had been a mistake. He shouldn't have gone to the park, shouldn't have confirmed what Victoria already suspected. Because now she knew, and knowing meant she'd keep coming back, keep asking questions, keep trying to fit him into a narrative that made sense to her. And the more she dug, the closer she'd get to things he couldn't let her find. He got up and walked into the kitchen, where Sophie was standing on a chair in front of the stove, pouring cereal into a bowl with intense concentration. "Morning, kiddo," he said. "Morning. I made breakfast. I can see that. Do you want some?" "Sure." She poured him a bowl, sloshing milk over the side, and handed it to him with a grin. He took it and sat down at the table, watching her climb into the chair across from him. "Did you have a good time at Mrs. Patterson's?" he asked. "She let me watch 2 episodes instead of 1. Rebel." Sophie giggled and took a bite of cereal, milk dripping down her chin. "Dad?" "Yeah? Are you okay?" He looked up, surprised. "Why do you ask?" "You look tired." "I'm always tired. More than usual." Daniel set his spoon down and reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I'm fine, Soph. Just got a lot on my mind." "Is it about work?" "Sort of." "Is someone being mean to you?" He smiled despite himself. "No, nothing like that." "Then what?" "Just grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." Sophie frowned, clearly unsatisfied with that answer, but she didn't push. She just went back to her cereal, swinging her legs under the table. Daniel's phone buzzed, and he pulled it out, expecting a text from a client, or maybe a reminder about a job he'd forgotten. Instead, it was another message from an unknown number. "I have a proposition. Not about the job. Something else. Call me when you have a chance. V.S." He stared at the message, his jaw tightening. She wasn't going to let this go. He set the phone down and finished his cereal, ignoring the way his pulse had started to pick up. Whatever Victoria Sterling wanted, it could wait. Right now he had a daughter to get ready for school and a life to keep running. But the message sat in the back of his mind all morning, nagging at him like a splinter he couldn't dig out. At noon, after he dropped Sophie off and finished the first half of a drywall job, he finally called the number. She picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Hayes, what do you want?" "Straight to the point. I appreciate that." "I don't have time for games, Ms. Sterling." "Neither do I," she said. "Which is why I'm calling. I have a problem, and I think you might be able to help me solve it." Daniel leaned against the side of his truck, his free hand rubbing the back of his neck. "I already told you, I'm not interested in the job. This isn't about the job. It's about something else. Something personal." That got his attention. "What kind of personal?" There was a pause, and he could hear the sound of her moving, a door closing, the faint hum of an office in the background. "Someone's been digging into my company," she said quietly, "looking for dirt, trying to find leverage. I don't know who yet, but I know it's happening, and I need someone I can trust to help me figure out who and why." "You have a whole company full of people you can trust." "Do I?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest. He'd heard that tone before. The tone of someone who'd been burned and didn't know who to turn to. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you're the only person in the last 8 years who hasn't wanted anything from me," Victoria said. "And right now, that's the only qualification that matters." Daniel closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the truck. He should say no. Should tell her to hire a security firm, a private investigator, someone whose job it was to deal with corporate espionage. But something in her voice stopped him. She wasn't asking as a CEO. She was asking as the woman who'd been lying in an alley 8 years ago, bleeding and scared and alone. "I'm not a detective," he said. "I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to watch my back, just for a little while, until I figure out who I'm dealing with. And if I say no, then I'll figure it out on my own. But I'd rather not." Daniel opened his eyes and stared at the sky, at the clouds moving slow and steady overhead. He thought about Sophie, about the life he'd built, about all the reasons this was a bad idea. Then he thought about the way Victoria had looked at him in the park, like she was holding on by a thread and didn't want to admit it. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking. I'm not making any promises." "I know." He hung up and shoved the phone back in his pocket, his mind already racing. This was a mistake. He knew it was a mistake. But he also knew he was probably going to do it anyway. Because walking away from someone who needed help had never been something he was good at, even when it would have been smarter. That night, after Sophie was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open in front of him. He hadn't touched it in weeks, maybe months, but the muscle memory came back fast. A few keystrokes, a few passwords he'd sworn he'd never use again, and he was in. The internet was a different place when you knew where to look. He started with Sterling Global, pulling up financial records, board meeting notes, internal memos that were supposed to be private but weren't if you knew how to bypass a firewall. Most of it was boring, quarterly earnings, expansion plans, the usual corporate noise, but buried in the noise were a few things that stood out. A pattern of small data breaches over the last 6 months. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that would raise alarms, but consistent enough to suggest someone was looking for something specific. A series of encrypted emails between Victoria and her CFO flagged by an internal security audit as potentially compromised. And a name that kept showing up in the margins, always just out of focus, always connected to people who had access, but no clear reason to be involved. Marcus Rain. Daniel pulled up a separate search and started digging. Marcus Rain was Victoria's second-in-command, her right hand, the man who'd been with Sterling Global since the beginning. On paper, he was loyal, competent, indispensable. But on paper didn't mean a damn thing. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. If Marcus was dirty, if he was the one feeding information to someone outside the company, then Victoria's instincts were right. She had a problem. A big one. He spent the next 2 hours going deeper, pulling threads he hadn't touched in years, accessing databases that technically didn't exist anymore. The picture that emerged was messy, incomplete, but troubling. Marcus had been making moves that didn't add up. Meetings with consultants who had no clear connection to Sterling Global. Financial transfers that were just small enough to avoid triggering automatic reviews. Email exchanges that used language so vague it was either incredibly stupid or deliberately obscure. Daniel's gut said deliberately obscure. He closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of sirens somewhere in the city. His phone sat on the table in front of him, silent and waiting. He picked it up and typed out a message before he could talk himself out of it. "I'm in, but we do this my way. No questions, no interference, and the second I think it's putting my daughter at risk, I'm out. Understood?" He hit send and set the phone down, staring at it like it might explode. The response came less than a minute later. "Understood. Meet me tomorrow, same place, 7 p.m. Daniel read the message twice, then locked the phone and pushed it away. He'd just crossed a line he'd sworn he'd never cross again, and he had no idea if he'd be able to find his way back. The next evening, Daniel showed up at Riverside Park 10 minutes early. The air was colder than it had been the night before, a sharp wind coming off the river that made him pull his jacket tighter. He found the same bench and sat down, watching the water move in dark, restless patterns. Victoria arrived exactly on time, walking toward him with the kind of precision that suggested she'd timed it down to the second. She wore a different coat, darker, more practical, and her hair was pulled back in a way that made her look younger, or maybe just less guarded. She sat down without a word, and for a moment they both stared at the river. "Thank you for coming," she said finally. "Don't thank me yet." "Fair enough." Daniel turned to look at her. "Before we go any further, I need to know what you're expecting from this. Because if you think I'm going to walk into your office and start interrogating your employees, that's not happening." "That's not what I'm asking." "Then what are you asking?" Victoria took a breath, and he could see her choosing her words carefully. "I'm asking you to help me figure out who I can trust. I've built this company from nothing, and somewhere along the way I stopped being able to tell the difference between loyalty and performance. Everyone smiles, everyone says the right things, but someone's selling me out, and I don't know who." "You think it's Marcus?" Her head snapped toward him, eyes wide. "How did you—" "I did some digging last night," Daniel said. "Nothing illegal, just looking at what's already out there. His name kept coming up in places it shouldn't." "What kind of places?" "The kind that make me think he's either the worst executive on the planet or he's playing a different game than the one you think he's playing." Victoria's jaw tightened. Marcus has been with me for 12 years. He helped me build this company. If he's the one, then you need to know, Daniel said. And you need to know before it blows up in your face. She looked away, her hands clenched in her lap. I don't want it to be him. I know. If it is, it means I've been blind for over a decade. It means everything I thought I knew about my own company was wrong. Or it means you trusted someone who didn't deserve it, Daniel said. That's not the same thing as being blind. That's just being human. Victoria let out a short, bitter laugh. Being human is expensive. Yeah, it is. They sat in silence for a moment, and Daniel watched her process what he'd just told her. He could see the wheels turning, the CEO in her already running through scenarios, calculating risks, planning next moves. What do you need from me? She asked. Access to your building, your systems, your meetings. I need to be able to move around without raising suspicion. That's going to be difficult. People will ask questions. So give them an answer. Tell them you're bringing in a consultant, an outside contractor to review security protocols, something boring enough that no one cares. Victoria considered this. That could work, but it means you'll have to actually show up, be present, visible. I can do that, as long as it's on my schedule. Your daughter. My daughter, he confirmed. She nodded slowly. Okay, I'll set it up, but Daniel, what? If we do this, if we find out it's Marcus or someone else close to me, I need you to tell me, no matter how much it's going to hurt. Daniel looked at her, at the determination in her eyes mixed with something that looked a lot like fear. I will, he said. That's a promise. Good. She stood and he stood with her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two people who'd been strangers a week ago and were now standing on the edge of something neither of them fully understood. I'll have my assistant send you the details, Victoria said. You can start Monday. Monday works. She started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. Daniel? Yeah? I meant what I said. Thank you. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and she walked away into the growing darkness. Daniel stayed on the bench for a while longer, watching the lights on the opposite shore flicker and blur. He thought about Marcus Rain, about corporate espionage, about the mess he was about to step into. But mostly, he thought about Sophie, and whether he'd just made a decision that would keep her safe or put her in more danger than he could handle. He didn't have an answer, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. Over the weekend, Daniel kept his routine as normal as possible. Saturday morning, he took Sophie to the park, pushing her on the swings while she shrieked with laughter and demanded he push higher, higher, until he was convinced she was going to launch into orbit. They got ice cream afterward, even though it was too cold for it, and she complained about brain freeze while he pretended to be unsympathetic. You brought this on yourself, kiddo. But it hurts. That's what happens when you eat frozen things too fast. You're mean. I'm practical. She stuck her tongue out at him and he ruffled her hair, and for a little while everything felt normal. On Sunday, Mrs. Patterson watched Sophie while Daniel made a trip into the city. He told Sophie he had to check on a job site, which wasn't entirely a lie, but it also wasn't the whole truth. She accepted it with a shrug and went back to building something elaborate out of blocks that looked like it might collapse at any second. Daniel took the subway to Manhattan and walked to Sterling Global's headquarters, standing across the street and studying the building like he was planning a heist. 47 floors of glass and steel, security checkpoints at every entrance, cameras covering every angle. Getting in would be easy enough with the right credentials. Moving around unnoticed would be harder. He spent an hour walking the perimeter, noting entrances, exits, blind spots. Old habits. The kind that had kept him alive when alive wasn't a guarantee. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. You'll have a badge waiting for you at the front desk Monday morning. 8 a.m. Don't be late. He typed back, I'm never late. Her response came immediately. We'll see. Daniel allowed himself a small smile and headed back to the subway. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that made you want to stay in bed and pretend the world didn't exist. Daniel got Sophie ready for school, made her breakfast, and walked her to the bus stop, same as always. You look fancy, Sophie said, eyeing the button-down shirt he'd put on under his jacket. I have a meeting. Is it important? Sort of. Are you nervous? He looked down at her. at the way she was studying him with those sharp, perceptive eyes that missed nothing. Why would I be nervous? Because you're wearing your fancy shirt and you combed your hair. I always comb my hair. Not like that. The bus pulled up and he kissed the top of her head. Have a good day, Soph. I'll see you this afternoon. Okay, don't mess up your meeting. I'll do my best. She climbed onto the bus and he waited until it pulled away before turning and heading toward the subway. Sterling Global's lobby was everything he expected and nothing he wanted. Polished marble floors, abstract sculptures that probably cost more than his yearly income, and a security desk staffed by 2 guards who looked like they took their jobs very seriously. Daniel walked up to the desk and gave his name. Daniel Hayes. I'm supposed to have a badge waiting. The guard checked his computer, clicked a few things, then nodded and handed over a temporary access card. You're cleared for floors 1 through 47. Ms. Sterling's office is on 47. Elevators are to your right. Thanks. Daniel clipped the badge to his shirt and headed for the elevators, very aware of the cameras tracking his movement. The ride up was smooth, silent, and filled with people in expensive suits who didn't make eye contact. When the doors opened on the 47th floor, Victoria's assistant was waiting for him. Mr. Hayes, Ms. Sterling is expecting you. Follow me, please. Daniel followed her through a maze of hallways and open workspaces, past conference rooms with glass walls and offices that looked like they belonged in magazines. Everyone he passed looked busy, focused, moving with the kind of efficiency that came from knowing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. The assistant stopped at a door near the end of the hall and knocked once before opening it. Victoria's office looked exactly the same as it had the first time he'd been here. Same glass desk, same minimalist furniture, same view of the city stretched out below like a map of ambition. Victoria stood when he entered, and he noticed she looked tired. Not in an obvious way, but in the way someone looked when they'd been running on caffeine and willpower for too long. Daniel, thank you for coming. You're paying me to be here. Not yet, I'm not. Details. She almost smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Have a seat. We need to go over a few things before I introduce you to the team. Daniel sat, and she came around the desk, perching on the edge of it instead of sitting in her chair. Closer. More personal. First, she said, your cover story. As far as anyone knows, you're a consultant I've brought in to review our security protocols and site management procedures. It's vague enough that people won't ask too many questions, and it gives you a reason to be everywhere. Works for me. Second, you'll report directly to me, no one else. If you find something, you tell me first. Understood? Understood. Third, she said, and her voice dropped slightly, if at any point you feel like this is putting you or your daughter at risk, you walk away. No questions asked, no hard feelings. Daniel looked at her, surprised. I thought you needed this solved. I do, but not at the expense of a 7-year-old's safety. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Victoria straightened and walked back around her desk, pulling out a folder and handing it to him. This is everything we have on the security breaches. Dates, times, what was accessed. It's not much, but it's a start. Daniel opened the folder and scanned the contents. 6 incidents over 4 months. Small files, mostly financial projections and internal communications. Nothing earth-shattering on its own, but together it painted a picture of someone building a case. Who had access to these files, he asked. About 30 people, executives, senior managers, IT staff. And Marcus is one of them. Marcus is one of them, she confirmed. Daniel closed the folder and looked up at her. You ready to introduce me to your team? As ready as I'll ever be. She led him out of her office and down the hall to a large conference room where about a dozen people were already seated, laptops open, coffee cups scattered across the table. The conversation stopped the moment Victoria walked in, and Daniel felt every pair of eyes in the room land on him. Everyone, Victoria said, her voice cool and professional. This is Daniel Hayes. He's a consultant I've brought in to review our security and site management procedures. He'll be working closely with us over the next few weeks, so please extend him your full cooperation. A few nods, a few murmured greetings, and one man at the far end of the table who stood and walked over with his hand extended. Marcus Rain, he said, his smile warm and genuine. Victoria's told me a lot about you. Daniel shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the direct eye contact, the easy confidence. All good, I hope. Of course. We're looking forward to having an outside perspective. Sometimes you get too close to something and miss the obvious. That's the idea. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder and returned to his seat, and Daniel took the empty chair Victoria gestured to. For the next hour, he sat through a meeting that was equal parts strategy session and performance review. People talked about expansion timelines, budget allocations, risk assessments. Marcus led most of the discussion, and Daniel had to admit the man was good, sharp, articulate. The kind of person who made everyone around him feel like they were part of something important, which made him either an excellent executive or an excellent liar. Daniel wasn't sure which yet. When the meeting finally wrapped up, Victoria caught his eye and gave a small nod toward the door. He followed her out, and she led him to a smaller office down the hall. "What do you think?" she asked once the door was closed. "I think Marcus is exactly what you'd expect him to be." "Which is?" "Smart, charismatic, good at making people trust him." "That's not exactly damning evidence." "No," Daniel agreed, "but it's not exonerating either." Victoria crossed her arms, leaning against the desk. "So, what's next?" "Next, I start looking at where people go when they're not in meetings, who they talk to, who they avoid, the stuff that doesn't show up in reports." "And how long will that take?" "As long as it takes." She didn't look happy with that answer, but she nodded. "Keep me updated." "I will." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Daniel?" "Yeah?" "Be careful." He looked back at her, at the worry in her eyes that she was trying very hard to hide. "Always am," he said. Then he walked out, back into the maze of hallways and expensive suits, and started doing what he did best: watching, waiting, and looking for the cracks. For the first 3 days, Daniel did exactly what he said he would. He watched. He showed up at Sterling Global every morning at 8, badge clipped to his shirt, and moved through the building like he belonged there. He sat in on meetings he wasn't invited to, asked questions that sounded technical but were really about people, and spent his lunch breaks in the break room listening to gossip that no one thought mattered. It always mattered. Marcus was everywhere. In every meeting, every decision, every conversation that shaped the direction of the company. He had a way of making people feel heard, of nodding at the right moments and asking questions that made them think harder. Daniel watched him work a room during a budget review, saw the way he diffused tension with a joke, redirected criticism with a compliment, made Victoria look like the smartest person in the building even when she wasn't the one talking. It was impressive. It was also exactly what someone would do if they were playing a long game. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel followed Marcus to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office. Not in an obvious way. Just happened to need coffee at the same time. Happened to be walking in the same direction. Marcus went in, ordered something complicated that took the barista 2 tries to get right, and sat down at a corner table with his phone. Daniel ordered black coffee and took a seat near the window where he could see Marcus in the reflection of the glass. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Marcus scrolled through his phone, sipped his drink, checked his watch twice. Then a man in a gray suit walked in, scanned the room, and sat down across from him. Daniel didn't recognize him. Mid-40s, neat haircut, expensive watch. The kind of guy who could have been a lawyer or a banker or a consultant. They didn't shake hands, didn't exchange pleasantries, just started talking in low voices that didn't carry past their table. Daniel pulled out his own phone and pretended to scroll while keeping his eyes on the reflection. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see body language. The way the man in the gray suit leaned forward. The way Marcus's shoulders tensed. The way they both glanced around the room like they were checking for witnesses. After 5 minutes, the man slid a manila envelope across the table. Marcus picked it up, opened it just enough to see inside, then closed it and tucked it into his briefcase. The man stood, said something Daniel couldn't catch, and walked out. Marcus stayed for another 2 minutes, finishing his coffee like nothing had happened. Then he stood, threw his cup in the trash, and headed back toward the office. Daniel waited 30 seconds, then followed. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and started digging into the man in the gray suit. He pulled the coffee shop's security footage, not legally, but not exactly illegally either, and ran the man's face through a database he still had access to from his old life. The match came back in less than a minute. Gerald Faust, corporate attorney, specialty in mergers and acquisitions, client list that read like a who's who of companies that had been bought out, broken up, or destroyed in hostile takeovers. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. Marcus was meeting with a vulture, the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to dismantle something from the inside and sell off the pieces. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Victoria. "We need to talk, in person, not at the office." Her response came 2 minutes later. "When?" "Tomorrow. After work, same place as before." "I'll be there." Daniel locked his phone and closed his laptop, his mind already running through what he was going to say, how he was going to explain that the man she'd trusted for 12 years was setting her up for a fall. He didn't sleep much that night. Victoria was already sitting on the bench when Daniel arrived at Riverside Park the next evening. She looked exhausted, not just tired, but worn down in a way that made him think she hadn't been sleeping either. He sat down next to her without a word, and for a moment they both stared at the water. "You found something," she said finally. "Yeah. Is it bad?" "It's bad." She closed her eyes and took a breath, like she was bracing herself. "Tell me." Marcus is meeting with a lawyer named Gerald Faust. Faust specializes in hostile takeovers, the kind where a company gets gutted from the inside and sold off in pieces. Victoria didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring at the water, like if she looked away, it would all become real. "You're sure?" she asked quietly. "I watched them meet. Saw Faust hand Marcus an envelope. I pulled Faust's client history. This is what he does, Victoria. He helps people destroy companies for profit. That doesn't mean Marcus is working with him." "No, but it means Marcus is talking to him. And unless you hired Faust yourself, that's not a conversation he should be having." Victoria's hands clenched into fists on her lap. "Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe Marcus is looking into acquisition opportunities. We've talked about expanding through mergers." "Have you talked about it with Gerald Faust?" She didn't answer. Daniel let the silence sit for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Look, I get it. You don't want it to be him. You've worked with him for over a decade. You trust him, but trust doesn't change facts. And the fact is, Marcus is having secret meetings with a lawyer who makes his money tearing companies apart. What do you want me to do?" Victoria's voice was tight, controlled, but he could hear the edge of something breaking underneath. "Fire him based on a coffee meeting? Accuse him of treason because he talked to someone I don't like? I want you to be careful. I want you to start watching what information he has access to. And I want you to consider the possibility that the person you've been building this company with is the same person trying to destroy it." Victoria turned to him, and the look in her eyes was raw. "If you're right, if Marcus is really doing this, then I've been blind for 12 years. I've trusted him with everything. He knows every weakness, every vulnerability, every mistake I've ever made. If he's selling me out, I don't just lose the company, I lose everything." "Then we make sure you don't lose." "How?" Daniel straightened and met her gaze. "We get proof. Real proof. Not just a meeting in a coffee shop, but something concrete that shows what he's doing and who he's doing it for. And then you decide what to do with it. And if we can't find proof, then we keep looking until we do." Victoria looked away, her jaw tight. "I don't know if I can do this. Pretend everything's fine while I'm waiting for him to stab me in the back." "You've been doing it for months already," Daniel said. "You knew something was wrong before I ever showed up. You just didn't know who. Now you do." Suspecting and knowing are different things. "Yeah, they are." She was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could see her working through it, weighing options, calculating risks. The CEO in her trying to find a strategy that didn't end with everything she'd built falling apart. "What's your next move?" she asked finally. "I'm going to get into Marcus's office. See what he's keeping that he doesn't want anyone to see." Victoria's head snapped toward him. "You can't do that. If he catches you, he won't. You don't know that. I know I'm better at this than he is at hiding it." She stared at him, and he could see the conflict playing out in her expression. The part of her that wanted to say no, to stay within the rules, to handle this the way a CEO was supposed to handle things. And the part of her that knew the rules didn't matter if the company was already burning down around her. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow night, after everyone's gone home. I'll get you access to his floor." "I already have access." "Then what do you need from me?" Daniel looked at her, at the woman who'd spent 8 years looking for the man who saved her life and was now trusting him to save her company. "I need you to keep him distracted. Make sure he's nowhere near the building. I can do that. And I need you to be ready for whatever I find. Because once we open this door, we can't close it again. Victoria nodded slowly. I know. They sat in silence for a while, watching the river move in dark, endless patterns. The sun was setting behind them, casting long shadows across the park, and Daniel could feel the weight of what they were about to do settling between them. Daniel? Victoria said quietly. Yeah? If this goes wrong, if Marcus finds out and things get ugly, I don't want you caught in the middle. You've already done more than I had any right to ask. Little late for that. I'm serious. You have a daughter, a life. I won't let this destroy that. Daniel turned to look at her, and something in her expression made his chest tighten. She meant it. She was willing to burn her own company to the ground before she let him pay the price for helping her. It won't come to that, he said. You don't know that. No, but I'm betting on it anyway. She almost smiled, almost. You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. This time she did smile, small and brief, but real. Thank you, Daniel. Don't thank me yet. We haven't found anything. I'm not thanking you for that. I'm thanking you for showing up, for caring, for being someone I can trust when I don't know who else to trust. Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and stood up. I'll call you tomorrow after I'm done. Be careful. Always am. He walked away and Victoria stayed on the bench, watching him disappear into the crowd. And for the first time since this whole mess started, she felt something that wasn't fear or anger or exhaustion. She felt hope. Saturday morning, Daniel took Sophie to the park like he did every weekend. She ran ahead of him, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, already making plans for which swing she was going to claim first. Dad, can we get pizza after? We had pizza last week. So we should probably eat something that's not pizza. But I like pizza. I know you do, kiddo, but you can't live on pizza alone. Why not? Because your body needs other things. Vegetables, protein, stuff that's not covered in cheese. Sophie wrinkled her nose. That sounds boring. Welcome to being a human. She laughed and ran toward the swings, and Daniel followed at a slower pace, watching her climb onto the seat and start pumping her legs. She was getting better at it, didn't need him to push her as much anymore, and he felt that familiar mix of pride and sadness that came with watching her grow up. His phone buzzed, and he pulled it out to see a message from Victoria. Marcus just confirmed dinner plans for tomorrow night. 7 p.m. at Marcello's. You'll have at least 2 hours. Daniel typed back. That's enough. He pocketed the phone and sat down on the bench, watching Sophie swing higher and higher, her hair flying behind her like a flag. She looked happy, safe, completely unaware that her dad was about to break into a corporate office to dig through files that might blow up someone's entire life. He wondered, not for the first time, if he was making the right choice. But then he thought about Victoria sitting alone on that bench, looking like she was holding the weight of the world on her shoulders. And he thought about the way Marcus had smiled at him during that first meeting, all charm and confidence, while secretly meeting with lawyers who destroyed companies for a living. Some people deserve to have their lives blown up. Sophie jumped off the swing mid-arc and landed hard, stumbling but catching herself. She turned to him with a huge grin. Did you see that? I saw it. That was pretty impressive. I'm getting braver. Yeah, you are. She ran over and climbed onto the bench next to him, swinging her legs. Dad? Yeah? Are you happy? The question caught him off guard. What makes you ask that? I don't know. You just seem different lately, like you're thinking about stuff all the time. Daniel looked at her, at the serious expression on her small face, and wondered how much she could actually see, how much she understood that he was trying to hide. I'm happy when I'm with you, he said. That's the truth. But what about when you're not with me? When I'm not with you, I'm thinking about making sure we're okay, that we have what we need. That's my job. But do you like your job? Daniel hesitated. It's complicated. That's what grown-ups always say when they don't want to answer. He laughed despite himself. You're too smart for your own good. That's what you always say. Because it's always true. Sophie leaned against his arm, and they sat there for a while, watching other kids play, listening to the distant sound of traffic and birds and the city moving around them. I love you, Dad, she said quietly. Daniel's throat tightened. I love you too, kiddo. More than anything. Even more than pizza? Even more than pizza. She grinned and jumped off the bench, running back toward the swings, and Daniel sat there watching her, trying to memorize this moment. The sound of her laughter, the way the sunlight caught in her hair, the pure, uncomplicated joy of a 7-year-old who still believed the world was mostly good. He'd do whatever it took to keep that belief alive, even if it meant breaking a few rules. Sunday night arrived with the kind of stillness that made Daniel's instincts itch. He dropped Sophie off at Mrs. Patterson's at 6:30, telling her he had to check on a job site and would be back by 9. Sophie gave him a long look, the kind that said she knew he was hiding something, but she just hugged him tight and told him to be careful. I'm always careful. You say that a lot, because it's always true. She didn't look convinced, but she let him go. Daniel took the subway into Manhattan and walked the 6 blocks to Sterling Global, keeping his head down and his hands in his pockets. The building was mostly dark, just a few windows lit on the lower floors where the overnight security team worked. He used his badge to get in through the side entrance, nodding at the guard who barely looked up from his phone. The elevator ride to the 46th floor, Marcus's floor, felt longer than it should have. Daniel watched the numbers climb, his pulse steady but his mind sharp, alert. He'd done this kind of thing 100 times before, but that was a lifetime ago, and he'd sworn he was done with it. Funny how things came back around. The floor was empty when he stepped out. Dark, except for the emergency exit signs and the faint glow of computer monitors left on standby. Daniel moved quietly down the hallway, checking doors, orienting himself. Marcus's office was at the far end, a corner unit with windows overlooking the city. The door was locked, but the lock was standard corporate issue, the kind that kept out honest people, but not people who knew what they were doing. Daniel pulled a small toolkit from his jacket pocket and had it open in under a minute. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, using his phone's flashlight to scan the room. Neat desk, filing cabinets, a bookshelf lined with business theory books that looked like they'd never been opened. Everything exactly where it should be, which meant the good stuff was hidden. Daniel started with the desk drawers, pens, notepads, a few client files that looked legitimate. Nothing interesting. He moved to the filing cabinet, picking the lock and flipping through folders. Contracts, personnel reviews, budget reports, all above board. 2 above board. He stood in the middle of the office and looked around, thinking like someone who had something to hide. Where would he keep it if he were Marcus? Not in the obvious places. Not somewhere that could be stumbled across during a routine audit. His eyes landed on the bookshelf. Daniel walked over and started pulling books off the shelf, checking behind them, feeling for anything that didn't belong. On the 3rd shelf, his hand brushed against something hard. He pulled the books away and found a small metal lockbox tucked behind a row of financial textbooks. Bingo. The lock on the box was better than the one on the door, but not by much. Daniel worked at it for 2 minutes before it clicked open. Inside were a flash drive, a burner phone, and a stack of printed emails. He pulled out the emails and started reading. They were between Marcus and someone using the initial G. The content was vague, coded in the kind of language that looked innocent if you didn't know what you were reading. References to restructuring opportunities and asset liquidation strategies and timeline acceleration. But buried in the corporate speak was a clear picture. Marcus was feeding information to someone who was planning a hostile takeover, and he was getting paid for it. Daniel's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of every page, working fast but thorough. He photographed the flash drive label, the burner phone's call log, everything that might be useful. He was halfway through the stack when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Daniel froze, his pulse spiking. The footsteps were getting closer, deliberate, heading straight for Marcus's office. He shoved the emails back into the lockbox, closed it, and put it back on the shelf just as the door handle started to turn. He killed his phone's flashlight and moved behind the door, pressing himself against the wall. The door opened, and Marcus walked in. He flipped on the lights and went straight to his desk, muttering something under his breath. Daniel held his position, barely breathing, watching Marcus through the gap between the door and the frame. Marcus pulled open a drawer and grabbed something, a folder, maybe, then stood there for a moment like he was thinking. Daniel's hand moved slowly toward the small knife he kept in his pocket, not because he wanted to use it, but because he needed to be ready if this went bad. Then Marcus's phone rang. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, and answered. Yeah, I'm grabbing it now. No, I'm at the office. Forgot I left it on my desk. A pause while the person on the other end spoke. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Just sit tight. He hung up, grabbed the folder, and walked back toward the door. Daniel pressed harder against the wall, barely daring to breathe. Marcus flipped off the lights and stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind him. Daniel waited until the footsteps faded, until he heard the elevator ding and the sound of it descending. Then he counted to 30 and slipped out of the office, locking the door behind him. He took the stairs instead of the elevator, moving fast but quiet, and didn't slow down until he was 6 blocks away and standing on a subway platform with his heart still hammering in his chest. That had been too close. Way too close. He pulled out his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the first ring. Did you find anything? Yeah, but we have a bigger problem. What kind of problem? Marcus showed up. I don't think he knows I was there, but it was close. There was silence on the other end, and Daniel could hear her breathing, fast and shallow. Are you okay? She asked. I'm fine, but we need to move fast. If he's spooked, if he thinks someone's on to him, he'll cover his tracks. What did you find? Emails, a burner phone, a flash drive, all hidden in his office. He's working with someone planning a takeover, and he's getting paid to feed them inside information. Do you have proof? I have pictures. It's enough to confront him, maybe enough to go to the board. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder. I want to see it. All of it. Tomorrow. First thing. Okay. And Daniel? Yeah? Thank you for taking that risk, for everything. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. I know, but still. He hung up and got on the subway, his mind already running through next steps, contingencies, ways this could still go sideways. He'd gotten what they needed, but he'd also almost gotten caught. And if Marcus started asking questions, started looking closer at the new consultant who'd been poking around, Daniel pushed the thought away and focused on getting home, on getting back to Sophie, on making sure that whatever happened next, she stayed safe. When he walked into Mrs. Patterson's apartment at 8:45, Sophie was asleep on the couch, curled up under a blanket with her shoes still on. Mrs. Patterson was dozing in her chair, the TV playing some old movie neither of them was watching. Daniel scooped Sophie up carefully, and she stirred but didn't wake, just wrapped her arms around his neck and mumbled something about dragons. Thanks, Mrs. Patterson, he said quietly. The old woman waved him off. Any time, dear. She's a good girl. Yeah, she is. He carried Sophie back to their apartment and tucked her into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin and brushing the hair out of her face. She looked so small, so fragile, and he thought about how close he'd come tonight to getting caught, to putting everything they had at risk. I'm sorry, kiddo, he whispered. I'm trying to do the right thing. I hope you understand that someday. Sophie didn't answer. Just kept sleeping, her breathing slow and steady, completely unaware of the mess her dad was tangled up in. Daniel sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, watching her sleep, and tried not to think about all the ways this could still go wrong. Monday morning came too fast and brought rain with it, the kind that turned the city gray and made everything feel heavier than it was. Daniel got Sophie ready for school through a fog of too little sleep and too much coffee, his mind still turning over the images he'd taken in Marcus's office. You look tired, Sophie said, watching him burn toast for the second time. I'm fine. You say that when you're not fine. Daniel scraped the blackened bread into the trash and started over. When did you get so observant? I've always been observant. You just don't always notice. He smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at him. Fair point. She finished her cereal and grabbed her backpack, pausing at the door. Dad? Yeah? Whatever you're doing that's making you tired, just be careful, okay? His chest tightened. I will, kiddo. I promise. She nodded, satisfied enough with that answer, and headed out. Daniel watched her go, then grabbed his phone and texted Victoria. I'll be there in an hour. We need to talk somewhere private. Her response was immediate. My office. 8 a.m. Daniel arrived at Sterling Global at 7:50, the rain still coming down in sheets that soaked through his jacket before he made it from the subway to the building. The lobby was quieter than usual, just a few early arrivers shaking off umbrellas and grabbing coffee from the cart near the elevators. He went straight to the 47th floor. Victoria's assistant wasn't at her desk yet, but Victoria's door was open. He knocked once and stepped inside. She was standing at a window, her back to him, and she didn't turn when he entered, just kept staring out at the rain-soaked city like she was looking for answers in the gray. "Close the door," she said. Daniel closed it and walked over, stopping a few feet behind her. "You okay?" "I don't know yet." She turned to face him, and he could see she'd had about as much sleep as he had, maybe less. "Show me what you found." He pulled out his phone and handed it to her. She took it and started scrolling through the pictures, her expression unreadable at first, then slowly hardening into something cold and sharp. "This is definitely him," she said quietly, stopping on a photo of one of the emails. "That's his handwriting on the notes in the margin." "Yeah." She kept scrolling, her jaw getting tighter with each image. When she reached the last one, she handed the phone back and walked over to her desk, bracing her hands against the edge like she needed something solid to hold on to. 12 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've worked with him for 12 years. I trusted him with everything. And this whole time, he's been setting me up to lose it all." Daniel pocketed his phone and gave her space. "I'm sorry. Don't be. You were right. I just didn't want you to be. What do you want to do?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her desk. Then she straightened and turned to face him, and the look in her eyes was different now, harder, more focused. "I want to confront him. I want him to explain why he did this, who he's working with, and how long he's been planning to destroy everything I built. That's a risk. If you confront him without leverage, he'll deny everything. He'll say the emails are fake, the evidence is planted, and then he'll know you're onto him. So what do you suggest?" "We set a trap. We give him enough rope to hang himself and make sure there are witnesses when he does it." Victoria crossed her arms. "What kind of trap?" Daniel walked over to the window and looked out at the rain. "The Midwest expansion deal, the one you were trying to hire me for, how critical is it?" "Critical. If it falls through, we lose investor confidence and about $200 million in projected revenue. And Marcus has access to all the details? He's been leading the negotiation." Daniel turned to face her. "Then we use that. We leak false information through Marcus, something big enough that whoever he's working with will have to act on it. And when they do, we'll know for sure who they are and what they're planning." Victoria frowned. "What kind of false information?" "A problem with the deal. Something that makes it look like the whole thing is about to collapse. If Marcus is feeding intel to someone planning a takeover, they'll jump on it. Try to accelerate their timeline, make a move before you can recover. And if they don't? Then we were wrong about Marcus, and you owe him an apology." She didn't smile. "I'm not wrong about Marcus." "No, you're not." Victoria walked back to her desk and sat down, her mind already working through the logistics. "We'd need to make it believable. If the information looks too convenient, he'll suspect a setup. So we make it messy. We stage a fight between you and the lead investor. Let it happen in a meeting where Marcus is present. Make it loud enough that people talk. And then what? Then we watch. We see who Marcus calls, who he meets with, what moves they make. And when they show their hand, we have them." Victoria studied him for a long moment. "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. "Something like it," Daniel said. "A long time ago. In your old life, the one you won't talk about." "Yeah." She didn't push, just nodded slowly and turned her attention back to the plan. "The quarterly investor meeting is Wednesday. I can stage something there, make it look like the expansion is falling apart." "Perfect. That gives us 2 days to set it up." "And what do you need from me?" "I need you to trust me, and I need you to be ready for whatever comes after." Victoria met his eyes, and he saw the fear there, buried under layers of control and determination. But he also saw something else. Resolve. "I'm ready," she said. "Good. Because once we start this, there's no going back." "I know." They spent the next hour going over details, planning the confrontation that would happen at the investor meeting, mapping out who would say what and when. It felt like planning a performance, which in a way it was. Except the stakes were higher than any play, and the audience wouldn't know they were watching a setup. When they were done, Victoria leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. "I keep thinking about all the times Marcus sat in this office and told me I was making the right call. All the decisions he helped me make. Was any of it real, or was he just playing me from the start? Does it matter?" She looked at him, surprised. Of course it matters. Why? Whether he meant it at the time or not doesn't change what he's doing now. People aren't static, they make choices. Sometimes those choices are good, sometimes they're terrible. What matters is what you do about it. Victoria was quiet, absorbing that. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Maybe I am. Did someone betray you in your old life? Daniel thought about his old team, about the choices that had been made and the people who'd paid the price. Yeah, someone did. What happened to them? They paid for it. The weight of those words sat between them, heavy and final, and Victoria didn't ask anything else. Tuesday passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria worked with her legal team to draft documents that looked real but were strategically flawed, the kind of thing that would send up red flags to anyone looking closely. She scheduled the investor meeting and made sure Marcus knew about it, made sure he understood how critical it was. Daniel stayed in the background, watching Marcus move through the building like nothing had changed. He went to meetings, smiled at colleagues, checked in with Victoria about the expansion like he gave a damn about its success. It was a hell of a performance. That evening, Daniel met Victoria at a small restaurant 3 blocks from her apartment. It was the kind of place where people went to not be noticed. Dim lighting and corner booths and waitstaff who'd seen enough to know when not to ask questions. They sat across from each other, and Victoria ordered wine she didn't drink while Daniel stuck with coffee. You nervous? He asked. Terrified. Good. Use that. Let it fuel the performance tomorrow. She looked at him over the rim of her wine glass. Do you ever get nervous? All the time. You don't show it. That's the point. Victoria set the glass down and leaned forward. Tell me something. Why are you really doing this? And don't say it's because I asked. There's more to it than that. Daniel considered the question, considered lying or deflecting or giving her the easy answer. But something about the way she was looking at him made him tell the truth. Because I know what it's like to build something and watch it get destroyed by someone you trusted, he said. And I know what it's like to feel like you're fighting alone. Nobody should have to do that. Is that what happened to you? Something like that. But you survived. Yeah, I survived. Victoria tilted her head slightly. And your daughter, Sophie, is she part of why you survived? Daniel's chest tightened. She's the only reason I survived. After everything fell apart, after I lost everything I thought mattered, I had her, and that was enough. Her mother really just left? One day she was there, next day she wasn't. Left a note saying she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't be a mother, couldn't be tied down. She needed to find herself or some shit like that. I'm sorry. Don't be. Sophie and I are better off. We have each other. That's all that matters. Victoria looked at him with something that might have been admiration or envy or both. You're a good father. I'm trying to be. That's more than a lot of people do. They sat in silence for a while, the conversation shifting to lighter things, safer things. But Daniel could feel the weight of tomorrow pressing down on both of them, the knowledge that they were about to set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. When they finally left the restaurant, Victoria walked him to the subway entrance. Thank you, she said, for all of this, for believing me when I said something was wrong, for not thinking I was paranoid or overreacting. You weren't overreacting. Your instincts were right. I hope they still are. They are. She hesitated, then reached out and touched his arm. Just briefly. Be careful tomorrow. Always am. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true. This time she smiled, small and sad. Then she turned and walked toward her building, and Daniel watched her go before heading down into the subway. Wednesday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of cold that made your breath fog in the air. Daniel dropped Sophie off at school and headed straight to Sterling Global, arriving an hour before the investor meeting was scheduled to start. Victoria was already in the conference room, reviewing documents with her legal team. She looked up when he entered, and their eyes met for just a second. A silent acknowledgement that this was it. The conference room filled slowly. Board members, senior executives, investors in expensive suits who looked like they ate companies for breakfast. And Marcus, walking in with his usual confidence, a leather portfolio under his arm, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He sat down next to Victoria, leaning over to murmur something Daniel couldn't hear. She nodded, her expression neutral, giving nothing away. The meeting started at 10. For the first 30 minutes, everything went according to plan. Financial reports, expansion timelines, projected returns. Victoria presented with the kind of polish that made it look effortless, and Marcus chimed in at the right moments with supporting data. Then Victoria got to the Midwest expansion. As you know, she said, her voice steady, this project represents a significant investment for Sterling Global. We've secured 3 distribution sites and negotiated contracts with local suppliers. However, there's been a development that requires immediate attention. She pulled up a document on the screen behind her, and Daniel saw Marcus's posture shift slightly. Not much, just enough. One of our lead investors has raised concerns about the environmental impact assessments, Victoria continued. They're threatening to pull funding unless we can provide additional documentation that will take at least 6 months to compile. The room went quiet. Daniel watched faces around the table, saw the concern ripple through the investors. One of them, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a tie that probably cost more than Daniel's rent, leaned forward. 6 months? That pushes the timeline back to next fiscal year. I'm aware, Victoria said, which means we lose the tax incentives, which means the entire financial model falls apart. I'm working on a solution. What kind of solution? And this was where it got interesting. Victoria's expression hardened, and Daniel could see her slipping into the role they'd planned. I'm in negotiations with the investor to find alternative documentation that meets their requirements without the extended timeline. And if you can't, then we'll have to consider restructuring the deal. The silver-haired investor stood up. Restructuring isn't an option, Ms. Sterling. We've committed capital based on the current timeline and returns. If those change, we're out. Victoria stood too, her voice sharper now. Then I suggest you give me the time I need to fix this instead of threatening to walk. I'm not threatening. I'm stating facts. You have 1 week to resolve this or we're pulling our investment. That's unreasonable. That's business. The room erupted into overlapping conversations, people taking sides, voices rising. Daniel watched Marcus through it all, saw the way his eyes were moving, calculating, taking in every word. Victoria let it go on for another 2 minutes, then held up her hand. Enough. We'll table this discussion until I have more information. This meeting is adjourned. People filed out, some still arguing, others already on their phones. Marcus lingered, waiting until the room was mostly clear before approaching Victoria. That was rough, he said quietly. You want me to reach out to the investor? See if I can smooth things over? No, I'll handle it. Victoria, you don't have to do this alone. That's what I'm here for. She looked at him, and Daniel saw something flash in her eyes. Anger, hurt, but she buried it fast. I appreciate that, Marcus. But I need to handle this myself. Marcus nodded, but Daniel could see he wasn't convinced. Okay, but if you change your mind, I'm here. He left, and Victoria waited until his footsteps faded before turning to Daniel, who'd been standing near the back of the room the whole time. How was that? She asked quietly. Perfect. He bought it. You sure? Positive. Now we wait. They didn't have to wait long. By Wednesday afternoon, Daniel's surveillance on Marcus started showing results. Marcus made 3 phone calls from his burner phone, all to the same number. He left the office early, unusual for him, and headed straight to the same coffee shop where Daniel had seen him meet with Gerald Faust. Daniel followed at a distance, keeping his head down and his pace casual. He watched Marcus enter the coffee shop and take the same corner table. 10 minutes later, Faust arrived, and they leaned in close, talking fast. Daniel couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. The body language told the story. Marcus was animated, urgent. Faust was calm, nodding, making notes on a tablet. They talked for 20 minutes, and then Faust slid a folder across the table. Marcus opened it, scanned the contents, and nodded. They shook hands. And just like that, the trap had been sprung. Daniel pulled out his phone and texted Victoria. He took the bait. Meeting with Faust right now. They're making their move. Her response came 30 seconds later. Follow him. I need to know what he does next. Daniel stayed on Marcus for the rest of the afternoon. Watched him go back to the office, pack up his things, and leave again an hour later. This time he went to a high-rise in Midtown, the kind of building that housed law firms and venture capital groups. Daniel waited across the street, watching the entrance. 40 minutes later, Marcus emerged with 2 other men. One of them was Faust. The other was someone Daniel didn't recognize, but the expensive suit and the confidence in his stride said money, real money. They stood on the sidewalk talking for a few minutes, then shook hands and went their separate ways. Daniel followed the stranger. He led Daniel on a path through Midtown, stopping once to take a call, then continuing to a black town car waiting at the curb. The driver opened the door and the man got in. Daniel managed to catch a glimpse of the license plate before the car pulled away. He memorized the number and immediately pulled out his phone, running it through a database he still had access to. The car was registered to a shell company, but the shell company had ties to a larger entity, Blackwell Industries. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Blackwell Industries was one of the biggest private equity firms on the East Coast. They specialized in hostile takeovers, buying struggling companies, stripping them for parts, and selling off whatever was left. They were ruthless, efficient, and exactly the kind of people who'd pay Marcus to sabotage Sterling Global from the inside. He called Victoria immediately. "We have a problem," he said when she answered. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that's bigger than Marcus. He's not working alone. He's working for Blackwell Industries." There was silence on the other end, and Daniel could practically hear her mind racing. "Blackwell," she said quietly. "They tried to buy me out 3 years ago. I turned them down. Looks like they didn't take it well. If Blackwell is behind this, they're not just trying to sabotage the expansion. They're trying to tank the whole company so they can buy it for pennies on the dollar. That's exactly what they're doing." Victoria's voice went cold. "Then we stop them." "How?" "I don't know yet, but we have 2 days before that investor deadline. 2 days to figure out how to turn this around." Daniel leaned against a building, watching people rush past him on the sidewalk. "We need leverage, something that makes Blackwell back off before they can make their move." "What kind of leverage?" "The kind that proves what they're doing is illegal. Corporate espionage, fraud, something that'll get them investigated and shut them down before they can hurt you." "And how do we get that?" Daniel thought about Marcus's office, about the emails and the flash drive he'd photographed. "We already have some of it, but we need more. We need proof that Blackwell hired Marcus. Direct communication, money trails, something that connects the dots in a way that can't be denied. Marcus won't just hand that over." "No, but he might lead us to it." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we push Marcus harder, make him panic. People make mistakes when they're panicking, and mistakes leave trails." "How do we make him panic?" Daniel smiled, though there was no humor in it. "We tell him the deal's back on, that you found a way to fix the investor problem and the expansion's moving forward. If he thinks he's about to lose his window, he'll move fast. And when he moves, we'll be watching." "That's risky." "Yeah, it is." "But you think it'll work?" "I think it's our best shot." Victoria took a breath. "Okay, let's do it. I'll need you to make the announcement tomorrow morning. Big, public, confident. Make it look like you pulled off a miracle." "I can do that." "Good. And Victoria?" "Yeah?" "Whatever happens next, stay close to people you trust. If Blackwell realizes we're onto them, they might try something desperate." "You think they'd come after me?" "I think desperate people do desperate things. So yeah, be careful." "I will. You too." Daniel hung up and stood there for a moment, watching the city move around him. He'd just set in motion something that could either save Victoria's company or blow up in both their faces. He hoped like hell it was the former. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind running through every possible scenario, every way this could go wrong. Around 2 in the morning, he gave up and went to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water and sitting at the table. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from Victoria. "Can't sleep either." He typed back, "Worried about tomorrow, worried about everything." Daniel stared at the screen, then called her. She picked up on the first ring. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey, you okay?" "I don't know. I keep thinking about what happens if this doesn't work. If Blackwell wins, if I lose everything." "You won't. You don't know that." "No, but I believe it. And you should too." There was silence, and then he heard her breathe out slowly. "Why do you have so much faith in me? You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you built a company from nothing. I know you're smart, tough, and you don't quit. That's more than most people have. And if it's not enough, then we figure out what comes next. But we're not there yet. Victoria laughed softly, and it sounded like she was crying a little too. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up. You would have figured it out. You always do. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone. They stayed on the phone for a while longer, talking about nothing important, just filling the silence with words that made the night feel a little less heavy. And when they finally hung up, Daniel felt something shift in his chest. He cared about her, not just because she'd hired him, not just because he owed her for the past, but because she was someone worth caring about, and that scared him more than anything Blackwell could throw at them. Thursday morning came with the kind of brightness that felt almost offensive, given how little sleep Daniel had gotten. He went through the motions of making Sophie breakfast, packing her lunch, getting her ready for school, all while his mind was already 6 hours ahead at Sterling Global. "You're doing it again," Sophie said, watching him put her sandwich in the wrong compartment of her lunchbox. "Doing what?" "Thinking about grown-up stuff instead of paying attention." Daniel looked down at the lunchbox, then fixed his mistake. "Sorry, kiddo. Got a lot on my mind today." "Is it important?" "Yeah, pretty important." Sophie studied him with those eyes that saw too much. "Are you helping someone?" The question caught him off guard. "Why do you ask that?" "Because you look like you did when you helped Mr. Chen fix his stairs, all serious and focused, like you're trying to solve a problem that's not yours, but you're making it yours anyway." Daniel crouched down to her level. "You're too smart, you know that? You always say that when I'm right." "Because you always are." He brushed a strand of hair out of her face. "Yeah, I'm helping someone who needs it." "Then I hope it works out." "Me too." She hugged him tight, and he held on a second longer than usual, drawing strength from the weight of her small arms around his neck. Whatever happened today, whatever went down at Sterling Global, he had to make sure he came back to this. To her. He dropped her at school and headed straight into Manhattan. Victoria's announcement was scheduled for 9:30. Daniel arrived at Sterling Global at 8:45 and went directly to her office. She was standing at the window again, but this time she turned when he entered. She looked different, sharper, like she'd used the sleepless night to hone herself into something harder. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." "You remember what to say?" "Every word." She walked over to her desk and picked up a folder. "The fabricated documentation is here. Environmental assessments that don't actually exist but look legitimate enough to buy us time. If Marcus checks, and he will, it'll hold up to surface scrutiny." "Good. What about the investors?" "I called the lead investor last night, told him I had a solution. He's skeptical but willing to listen. He doesn't know it's fake. He knows the timeline is aggressive, but he also knows I don't make promises I can't keep, so he's giving me the benefit of the doubt." Daniel nodded. "Once you make the announcement, Marcus is going to move fast. He'll contact Blackwell, tell them the window's closing. That's when we'll get our proof. And you'll be watching. Every second." Victoria met his eyes, and something passed between them. Not quite fear, not quite trust. Something in the middle that felt like two people standing on the edge of a cliff together, knowing one of them might fall but choosing to jump anyway. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. For not walking away when you could have. We've been over this." "I know, but I needed to say it again." Before Daniel could respond, her assistant knocked and poked her head in. "Miss Sterling, everyone's ready in the conference room." "Thank you, I'll be right there." The assistant disappeared and Victoria picked up the folder and turned back to Daniel. "Here we go. Here we go." The conference room was packed. Board members, executives, the same investors from yesterday's meeting, and Marcus sitting in his usual spot near the front, his expression carefully neutral. Daniel stood in the back, arms crossed, watching everything. Victoria walked to the head of the table and set down her folder with a deliberate thud that got everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she said, her voice clear and commanding. "I know yesterday's meeting ended on a difficult note. The environmental concerns raised by our lead investor were significant, and I want to address them directly." The room was silent. Daniel watched Marcus lean forward slightly, his focus absolute. "I spent last night in conversation with environmental consultants and legal advisors," Victoria continued. And I'm pleased to announce that we've secured alternative documentation that meets all regulatory requirements without extending our timeline. The silver-haired investor from yesterday spoke up. What kind of documentation? Victoria opened the folder and pulled out several sheets, sliding them across the table. Independent environmental impact assessments from 3 certified firms, all showing compliance with local, state, and federal regulations, all dated within the last 6 months. The investor picked up the documents and started reading. The room held its breath. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up. These appear to be in order. They are. Which means the Midwest expansion moves forward as planned. Timeline unchanged. Financial projections unchanged. We break ground in 3 weeks. The mood in the room shifted immediately. Relief, excitement. A few people already pulling out phones to make calls. Daniel watched Marcus through it all, saw the moment the news registered, saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "That's excellent news, Victoria," Marcus said, his voice smooth but missing its usual warmth. "Congratulations on pulling this together so quickly." "Thank you, Marcus." The meeting wrapped up quickly after that, people filing out with renewed energy, already planning next steps. Marcus lingered, waiting until the room was mostly clear before approaching Victoria. Daniel stayed where he was, close enough to hear but far enough to look uninvolved. "That was impressive work," Marcus said. "How did you manage to get those assessments so fast?" "I have good relationships with the right people." "Clearly, though I'm surprised you didn't mention you were pursuing this avenue yesterday. I could have helped." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I handled it. I can see that." Marcus's gaze flicked to Daniel for just a second, then back to Victoria. "Well, this certainly changes things. I'll need to update our financial projections, notify the construction teams." "You do that." Marcus nodded and left, and Daniel watched him go, already pulling out his phone before he was even out of the conference room. Victoria waited until the door closed, then turned to Daniel. "He's going to call them." "Yeah, he is." "How long before we know?" "Give it an hour, maybe less." Daniel was right. 45 minutes later, Marcus left the building and headed straight for the same coffee shop. Daniel followed at a distance, watching through the window as Marcus sat down at the corner table and made a call. 3 minutes later, Gerald Faust walked in. Daniel pulled out his phone and started recording. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. Daniel couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. The body language told him everything. Marcus was agitated, talking fast, gesturing. Faust was calm, taking notes, occasionally asking questions that made Marcus lean in closer. Then Faust pulled out his phone and made a call. 2 minutes later, a third man arrived. Daniel recognized him immediately. The same man from yesterday. The one who'd gotten into the town car, registered to Blackwell Industries. Now they were all sitting together, and the conversation got more intense. Papers came out. Faust showed them something on his tablet. The Blackwell representative nodded, said something that made Marcus's shoulders drop in what looked like relief. Then the representative stood, shook both their hands, and left. Daniel followed him. The man walked 4 blocks to a parking garage, got into the same black town car, and drove to a high-rise office building in the financial district. Daniel watched him enter, then pulled out his phone and called a number he hadn't used in 3 years. A woman's voice answered. "I thought you were done with this life." "I thought so too. I need a favor." "What kind of favor?" "The kind that involves corporate records and doesn't leave fingerprints." There was a pause. "This is dangerous, Hayes." "I know, but I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Another pause. "What do you need?" "Financial records between Blackwell Industries and a man named Marcus Rain. Payment trails, contracts, anything that shows a relationship." "That's going to take time." "I've got until tomorrow morning. Can you do it?" "For you?" "Yeah, but you're going to owe me." "Add it to the list." She laughed. "I'll call you in 6 hours." Daniel hung up and headed back to Sterling Global. He found Victoria in her office, pacing like a caged animal. "Well?" she demanded when he walked in. Marcus met with Faust and the Blackwell representative, all 3 of them together. "I got it on video." "That's proof of contact, but not proof of conspiracy." "I know, which is why I've got someone digging into financial records. If Blackwell's been paying Marcus, there'll be a trail. We just have to find it." Victoria stopped pacing and turned to face him. "And if we don't find it in time?" "Then we use what we have and hope it's enough to scare them into backing off." "That's not a plan. That's a prayer. Sometimes that's all you've got. Victoria sat down heavily in her chair and put her head in her hands. I can't lose this company, Daniel. I've put everything into it. 15 years of my life, every decision, every sacrifice, every relationship I didn't have because I was too busy building this. If Blackwell takes it, if they destroy it, I have nothing left. Daniel walked over and sat on the edge of her desk. That's not true. Yes, it is. No, it's not. You think the company is everything because it's been everything for 15 years, but it's not. You're still you without it. You're still brilliant, tough, capable. The company doesn't define you. It's just something you built. Easy for you to say. You walked away from your old life. And it almost killed me, Daniel said quietly. Walking away from something you've built feels like cutting off a limb. I know that. But I also know that on the other side of that pain, there's something worth having. A life that's yours, not just something you're maintaining. Victoria looked up at him, her eyes red. What if I don't know how to have that kind of life? Then you learn, same way you learned everything else. She laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple. It's terrifying. But it's also the only way forward. They sat in silence for a moment, and Daniel realized his hand had somehow ended up on hers. He started to pull back, but she held on. I'm glad you're here, she said. Me too. His phone rang, breaking the moment. He pulled it out and saw the number. I need to take this. He stepped into the hallway and answered. Talk to me. I found it, the woman said. Blackwell's been paying Marcus for 18 months, monthly deposits to an offshore account, $50,000 a month, like clockwork, plus a bonus structure tied to company performance. The worse Sterling Global does, the more he gets paid. Daniel felt his pulse spike. Can you send me everything? Already done. Check your email. You're a lifesaver. You're damn right I am. And Hayes, be careful. Blackwell doesn't play nice when they're cornered. I know. He hung up and went back into Victoria's office. We've got them. Victoria stood up so fast her chair rolled backward. What did you find? Payment records, 18 months of deposits from Blackwell to Marcus, $50,000 a month. We have proof. For the first time since this whole thing started, Victoria smiled. Really smiled. We have proof. Yeah, we do. So what's next? Next, we confront Marcus. But not alone. We do it with witnesses. The board, legal counsel, maybe even law enforcement. We make it so public and so documented that Blackwell can't sweep it under the rug. Victoria was already moving, pulling out her phone, making calls. I'm scheduling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Can you be there? Wouldn't miss it. And Daniel? Yeah? After this is over, after we've dealt with Marcus and Blackwell and everything else, I want to talk about what comes next. For both of us. Daniel looked at her, at the hope and fear and determination all mixed together in her expression, and nodded. Yeah, we can do that. That night, Daniel got home late. Sophie was already asleep and Mrs. Patterson was dozing in her chair again. He thanked her, carried Sophie to bed, and then sat in the kitchen staring at his email. The evidence was all there. Payment records, email exchanges between Marcus and Blackwell executives, contracts that spelled out exactly what Marcus was being paid to do. Sabotage the expansion, tank investor confidence, make Sterling Global vulnerable enough for a hostile takeover. It was damning, complete, undeniable. And tomorrow, they'd use it to end this. Daniel closed his laptop and checked on Sophie one more time. She was sprawled across her bed, one arm hanging off the edge, completely peaceful. He pulled the blanket over her and sat on the edge of the bed. We're almost through this, kiddo, he whispered. Few more hours and we can go back to normal, whatever that means. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Daniel sat there for a long time, watching her breathe, and thought about Victoria's question. What came next? For the first time in 8 years, he didn't have an answer. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Daniel got Sophie ready for school, dropped her off with a kiss and a promise to pick her up on time, then headed into the city. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9, but Daniel arrived at 8 to help Victoria prepare. They went over the evidence one more time, made sure every document was in order, every piece of proof airtight. At 8:45, the board members started arriving. Serious faces, expensive suits, people who knew something big was about to happen, but not what. Marcus arrived at 8:50, looking calm and composed, and took his usual seat. At 9 exactly, Victoria stood at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she said. "I've called this meeting to address a matter of urgent importance to the future of Sterling Global." She pulled out the folder Daniel had prepared and set it on the table. For the past 18 months, someone within this company has been engaged in corporate espionage, feeding confidential information to an outside entity with the goal of sabotaging our operations and facilitating a hostile takeover. The room went dead silent. That person is Marcus Rain. Every head turned toward Marcus. He didn't move, didn't react, just sat there with the same calm expression he'd worn when he walked in. "That's a serious accusation, Victoria," he said quietly. "I hope you have proof." "I do." Victoria opened the folder and started distributing documents. Financial records showing monthly payments from Blackwell Industries to an offshore account in your name. Email correspondence between you and Blackwell executives discussing Sterling Global's vulnerabilities, and surveillance footage of you meeting with Blackwell representatives to coordinate your activities. Marcus picked up the documents in front of him and scanned them. Daniel watched his face, waiting for the moment it cracked. It didn't. "These records are incomplete," Marcus said calmly, "and the meetings you reference were exploratory conversations about potential partnerships. Nothing illegal." "Partnerships that you never disclosed to me or the board," Victoria said. "Partnerships that involved sharing confidential information and undermining our expansion efforts. I was protecting this company's interests. By getting paid $50,000 a month to destroy it?" Marcus set down the documents and looked around the table. "I've worked with Victoria for 12 years. I've helped build this company from a regional operation to a national presence. And now, because of a business disagreement, she's accusing me of treason based on circumstantial evidence and paranoid speculation." "It's not speculation," Daniel said from the back of the room. Marcus turned to look at him. "And who are you exactly? The consultant she brought in a few weeks ago, the stranger with no background, no credentials, who somehow has access to offshore financial records that are supposed to be confidential?" "I'm the person who caught you," Daniel said evenly, "and the records aren't circumstantial, they're fact. You've been on Blackwell's payroll for 18 months. You've been feeding them information, and you've been sabotaging this company from the inside. Prove it." Daniel pulled out his phone and played the video he'd recorded at the coffee shop. Marcus, Faust, and the Blackwell representative, all sitting together, papers spread across the table. "That proves I had a meeting," Marcus said. "It doesn't prove conspiracy." "Then how do you explain the payments?" Victoria demanded. "Consulting fees. Blackwell approached me months ago about potentially joining their firm. We've been in discussions. Discussions that involved you sharing Sterling Global's confidential expansion plans. I shared nothing that wasn't already public knowledge." Victoria's hands were shaking now, and Daniel could see her struggling to keep her composure. Marcus was good, better than they'd anticipated. He had an answer for everything, a plausible explanation that would create just enough doubt. But Daniel had one more card to play. "What about the flash drive in your office?" he said. Marcus went very still. "The one you keep in a lockbox behind your books. The one with encrypted files containing Sterling Global's financial projections, investor contracts, and internal communications." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Because I found it, and I copied it." The color drained from Marcus's face. "You broke into my office?" "I investigated a suspected security breach, and I found evidence of corporate espionage." Daniel looked at Victoria. "The flash drive contains emails between Marcus and Blackwell that spell out the entire plan. Timeline, targets, payment structure, everything." Marcus stood up, his calm finally cracking. "You had no right. I had every right," Victoria said, her voice like ice. "This is my company, and you tried to destroy it. I built this company with you, and then you sold it out the moment someone offered you a better deal." Marcus looked around the table, seeing the expressions on the board members' faces. Shock, disgust. No one was on his side anymore. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Victoria said. "You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out, and I'm forwarding all of this evidence to federal prosecutors. Corporate espionage is a criminal offense, Marcus. You didn't just betray me, you broke the law." Marcus grabbed his briefcase and walked toward the door, but he stopped when he reached Daniel. "You think you're the hero here?" he said, his voice low. "You're just another mercenary. Another gun for hire. The only difference between you and me is I was honest about what I wanted." "No," Daniel said. "The difference is I know the difference between loyalty and a paycheck. You never did." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then walked out. The room stayed silent for a full minute after he left. Then one of the board members spoke up. "Victoria, I think I speak for everyone when I say we support whatever actions you need to take to protect this company." The other board members nodded in agreement. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly. "I appreciate that. And I promise you, Sterling Global will not only survive this, we'll come out stronger." The meeting adjourned and people filed out, some stopping to offer Victoria words of support. Daniel stayed in the back, watching her handle each conversation with grace and strength. When the last person left, Victoria turned to him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she walked over and hugged him. It surprised him, but after a second, he hugged her back. "We did it," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Yeah, we did. I couldn't have done this without you. You would have figured it out. Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." They stood there for a moment longer, then pulled apart. Victoria wiped her eyes and laughed. "I must look terrible. You look like someone who just saved her company." "Our company. You saved it as much as I did." Daniel shook his head. "It was always yours, Victoria. I just helped you protect it." "Still, thank you." "You're welcome." Victoria looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression, something uncertain but hopeful. "What you said before, about what comes next, did you mean it?" "Yeah, I did." "Good. Because I've been thinking, this company, everything I built, it almost cost me everything. My health, my relationships, any chance at a life outside of these walls. And I realized something while we were fighting Marcus. I don't want to spend the next 15 years the same way I spent the last 15. What do you want?" "I want balance. I want to run a company I'm proud of, but I also want a life that matters beyond quarterly earnings and expansion plans. And I think maybe you could help me figure out what that looks like." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "Victoria, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," she said quickly. "I know you have Sophie. I know your life is complicated. But maybe we could figure out something. A partnership. Not like the job I offered you before. Something different, something equal." Daniel thought about Sophie, about the life they'd built, about all the reasons this was complicated and messy and probably a terrible idea. Schwartz. Then he thought about the way Victoria had looked at him during that first meeting, the way she'd trusted him when she had no reason to, the way she'd stood in front of her board and fought for her company with everything she had. "I have one condition," he said. "Name it. Sophie comes first. Always. No matter what. If something comes up with her, if she needs me, everything else stops." Victoria didn't hesitate. "Of course. I wouldn't expect anything else. Then, yeah, let's figure something out." She smiled, and it was the first genuine, unguarded smile he'd seen from her. "Okay? Okay. So what does that look like? This partnership?" "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. Together. Together." 3 weeks later, Daniel stood in a park on a Saturday afternoon, watching Sophie climb to the top of a jungle gym while Victoria sat next to him on a bench. "She's fearless," Victoria said, watching Sophie hang upside down from a bar. "Too fearless sometimes." "She gets that from you." Daniel smiled. "Maybe." Sophie dropped from the bar and ran over, her face flushed and happy. "Did you see me?" "We saw you," Daniel said. "Very impressive." "Victoria, did you see?" "I did. You're very brave." Sophie grinned and turned to Daniel. "Can we get ice cream?" "It's November." "So?" "So it's freezing." "But I want ice cream." Victoria laughed. "I'll buy. My treat." Sophie's eyes went wide. "Really?" "Really. But only if you promise to finish your vegetables at dinner tonight." "Deal." She ran ahead toward the ice cream cart, and Daniel and Victoria followed at a slower pace. "You're good with her," Daniel said. "I'm trying. I've never really spent time around kids before." You're doing fine. Victoria looked at him. You think this can work? All of it? The company? Us? Sophie? I think it's messy and complicated, and there's no roadmap for any of it. That's not very reassuring, but I also think the best things usually are messy and complicated, and the fact that we're willing to try means something. Victoria reached over and took his hand. Yeah, it does. They caught up to Sophie at the ice cream cart, and she demanded chocolate with sprinkles and whipped cream, which Daniel vetoed in favor of chocolate with just sprinkles. They walked through the park together, Sophie chattering about school and her friends and a book she was reading, while the city stretched out around them in shades of gray and gold. Daniel thought about the last few weeks, about Marcus being escorted out of Sterling Global by security, about the federal investigation into Blackwell Industries that was already making headlines, about Victoria restructuring her executive team and bringing in people she could actually trust, about the way she'd asked him to stay involved, not as a consultant, but as a partner, someone who could help her build something better than what she'd had before. He'd said yes, but on his terms. Limited hours, flexibility for Sophie, no more secrets, no more living in the shadows. And Victoria had agreed without hesitation. It wasn't perfect. There were still late nights and complicated conversations and moments when Daniel wondered if he'd made the right choice. But there were also moments like this, walking through a park with his daughter and a woman who was starting to feel like more than just someone he'd helped. Dad? Sophie said, pulling him out of his thoughts. Yeah, kiddo? I like her. You like who? Sophie rolled her eyes. Victoria, I like her. She's nice. Daniel glanced at Victoria, who was pretending not to listen, but was clearly listening. Yeah, he said. She is. Are you guys dating? Victoria choked on air, and Daniel felt his face heat up. That's complicated. That means yes. That means we're figuring it out. Sophie considered this, then shrugged. Okay, just don't be weird about it. I'll do my best. They found another bench near the edge of the park, and Sophie sat between them, swinging her legs and working on her ice cream. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment everything felt still. Peaceful. Thank you, Victoria said quietly, so only Daniel could hear. For what? For showing up. For helping me when I didn't know how to ask. For not walking away when it would have been easier. You would have done the same. I don't know if that's true, but I'd like to think it is. Daniel looked at her, at the woman who'd spent 8 years searching for the man who saved her life, and had somehow ended up saving his in return. Not in the same way, not with violence and blood, but by reminding him that there was more to life than just surviving. That building something with someone else, something real and imperfect and worth fighting for, was just as important as the walls you built to keep yourself safe. I'm glad it was you, he said. What do you mean? That night, 8 years ago. I'm glad it was you I found. I'm glad you didn't give up looking, and I'm glad we ended up here. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Me too. Sophie looked up at them. You guys are being weird. Sorry, kiddo. It's okay. The good kind of weird. Daniel laughed and wrapped an arm around his daughter, and Victoria leaned against his shoulder, and they sat there watching the sun disappear behind the buildings. Somewhere in the city, Sterling Global was still running. Deals were being made, contracts signed, the machinery of business grinding forward. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Daniel Hayes had finally stopped running from his past and started building a future. What mattered was that Victoria Sterling had learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, only earned. And what mattered most was that Sophie, with her 2 smart observations and her fearless heart, had 2 people in her corner who would fight like hell to make sure she grew up knowing she was loved. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected, but it was the one they'd chosen. And that made all the difference.